pasted a number of questions I didn't get to last time as well. I pasted them on a document. And I have that on my screen. I have my famous one slide. And I thought I'd start by saying briefly this, and then it might come up in the questions. And I'll generally work it in some more about it. But you've heard me talk about this before, but I thought I would say it once again, and maybe this will be particularly helpful for you to hear and so forth this way. It's possible, it might not even be overstating things to say that like all of the bad and inefficiency in your life comes from, especially the, in other people's heads and in your head, the assumption without even realizing it about scarcity. And abundance and waste, which I have written below, are actually flip sides of a similar coin. When I use the word scarcity, that word can mean different things, and what I actually mean is the assumption of a static amount of something, and the ripple effects of this are really horrendous. And you can, when you spot yourself feeling kind of antsy or worried or frustrated or scared, or lashing out at somebody else, or feeling even guilty and upset with yourself, stressed out. And not just feelings, but this definitely impacts our actual strategy constantly and our decision making, and causes us to use suboptimal strategies. It has to do, we can think of this with time. Like if someone feels like they have a certain amount of time in which to learn OMG, or in a totally different type of example, sometimes people can feel intuitively like there's a certain amount of money in the world. It isn't that people would affirm this or not, but they often don't realize they believe it, even though it's kind of fairly obviously not true. But people, and once you, the interesting thing is once you believe that there's a certain amount of a resource that's necessary to have good, and let's just take the case of money just because it's easy to see. I'm using that again as an example because it's probably most easy to understand. If there was a static amount of money, then it must be that if someone has more, then someone has to have less, right? And what's fascinating is, I talk about property rights, and the reason I do that, I care about public policy, and I'd like people to stop taxing me and so forth. But when I talk about things, there's typically, it's because it really is very important to you on a daily basis as well. I'm sorry, I'm just, when I'm talking live, I sometimes lose my train of thought. When I'm doing recordings, I get to pause it at times like this. But with property rights, what's fascinating is that even though the idea that people own their own bodies or their own money makes sense, if we think that there's only a set amount of money, then this might be kind of fascinating. It helps explain why, in practice, people don't really believe in property rights very pervasively at all, right? Legally in America, for example, the government owns everything that you have, your body, your money, and everything. It's only because they don't happen to take it all. But legally, they pretty much can. If they just legislated 100% tax, then that would be the law would be that way. There's nothing stopping them from doing that, right? Plus they have guns and so forth. And then they can enslave you however they want. Public slavery is outlawed, but slavery by the government is expressly legal and it's been legal since right after they outlawed slavery and then outlawed involuntary servitude in the 13th Amendment. Then there was a Supreme Court case a few years later, because what about the government enslaving people? And they ruled that was totally fine in terms of a draft or jury duty. But there's no limit on it. There just has to be the idea that as long as the government feels like it's for the good of someone else, then it's totally legal to enslave you. So legally, you don't own any property except for what the government happens to not take from you at any one time. So why? But that now I point that out because it's interesting that we live in that situation, but it's not looked at as like a 4-alarm fire. It's not looked at as that big a deal. People tend to think you need to have taxation. And again, my point in this is not about taxation or government, but how easy it is for people to ditch the idea of property rights, even though in one sense the idea that we own our bodies or our property makes really good sense. We would wonder, why would people want to violate that? My point of bringing that up is to show how powerful the assumption of the static amount of good stuff is in people's minds, that it's false, but it looks true. And it can be made true by kind of stipulating a certain, but if we narrow down situations, of course, we can make a situation where within that game or within that time period or within certain rules or whatever, there's a certain amount of money or there's a certain amount of time that you have for a deadline or a certain amount of any sort of resource. But time and money are easy to see. So it's such a powerful assumption that that it even overpowers the idea of property rights, and to the extent that we pretty much have to just memorize exceptions to the idea that we don't own property. Like we're not taught that rape is bad because it violates property rights. We're just taught that rape is bad because it is, right? Essentially, and we have to memorize that. We feel, I mean, a lot of us, including myself, feel it intuitively as well, like it's horrendous. But the point is that it isn't like there's this broad-based idea. So what this is going to do is it's going to, one of the questions on the sheet from last time was how did I build, how did I use, or what was the one main way that I used LOI to build OMG, to use a couple of three-letter acronyms, right? Law of implication to build our business OMG machines. And I don't know if this is the main, well, in one sense, it's always a main thing. It's that this is going to sneak in just so constantly. And another, I know I didn't get very specific there, but let's see. So this is going to poison your relationships, including your business relationships. It's going to come up where you feel like it's going to appear like, okay, I want this and this person's in my way. But if you dig into that situation where you're feeling like that, and it could be like an ally of yours or a friend or a business partner, you know, like, and this is such a leading cause of either businesses not taking off as they could or just client. This can absolutely come up with clients and business relationships like that. And I'll develop that, but also let me say also that if you can the more you can work the idea of abundance into your thinking, and abundance is more than plenty. You see, the assumption of there being a static amount of good stuff is so strong sometimes. It's not the only thing people think. People kind of waffle between both the idea of abundance and the idea of static and scarcity. They tend to have conflicting and contradictory ideas about that within their belief system. But the assumption of a static amount of good stuff is so intertwined and ingrained in our belief that people twist the idea of abundance to mean something like plenty, like, yeah, there's a limited amount of good stuff, but at least there's enough for everyone to have a whole bunch of it. So that we could call plenty, and we could put it up here on this line. And plenty is different than abundance. And when I say waste, once you have a situation, you either have a situation where there's a static amount of good stuff, or you have a situation where good leads to good and bad leads to bad in the same universe, so to speak, in the same situation, the same country or planet or business or relationship or whatever. In a relationship between two people, if we imagine either a business or romantic relationship, then there's not a static amount of happiness. I don't mean overall, but just in terms of your relationship with one other person, in terms of what you contribute to their lives and what they contribute to yours. It's a great great illustration of what I mean by abundance and waste, as being intrinsically part of the same situation, and you're going to choose one or the other, but it's not static. So you're in a romantic relationship with someone else, let's imagine. And based on the way that you relate to each other day by day, then not talking again about your overall happiness, but about the happiness that you contribute to the other person in terms of your romantic interaction, there can be a bunch of happiness leading to more happiness, and there can also be a bunch of bad, like reactions, responses, looks, judgments, actions, and so forth that just lead to more waste. Like bad leads to bad, right? If you respond in a bad way, I'm using bad kind of simplistically, but in a useful way. If you respond badly to a person that you're in a romantic relationship with, and again, this is also very applicable for business, but if you respond badly, that's going to tend to lead to waste in the sense that it leads to even more bad. It's not that you're wasting a static resource. That's also not quite what I mean when I say waste. What I mean is sort of like, again, like the flip side of good is good leads to good, is this idea that bad leads to bad. Ultimately, that's how existence is that bad leads to bad and good leads to good. Good doesn't come out of bad and bad doesn't come out of good. It can seem that way when you have a conglomerate situation with a bunch of factors and good and bad things in it. And then if you take a situation like that, an event or a business or a relationship or whatever that has good and bad mixed in with it, if you then seek good, then yeah, good will come out of it. But the good didn't come out of bad. It came out of seeking good. The thing is, the assumption of if you take a situation that is going to either be abundant or wasteful, depending on whether you feed it good or feed it bad, then but if you take a situation like that, if you're genuinely in that type of situation, but if you imagine instead that it's static, that there's just a certain amount of good stuff, then it's going to poison things, and you're going to generally get waste. Let's see. I'll let that kind of come out as we discuss for now and see how it works out, letting it do that. I do have, again, some previous questions on a sheet, but let me take a look at what we have here for today first. Oh, there's one question that I addressed at the end of the last session briefly, and I'm going to do another brief quick touch on it. I just want you to have it like on your mental screen as well. And it relates a little bit to some things I just saw here too. I'll just put it below here. It doesn't necessarily relate perfectly, but and right, understanding and mismatching. Fundamentally, the idea of law of implication is that there's I'll phrase this in kind of a slightly different way than maybe I always kind of phrase it kind of from scratch a little bit. The quality of your life, the quality of your whole existence is going to be, first we can divide it into two factors. One is environment, luck, and so forth, factors that are outside of your control, including first outside of the control of yourself, but then also we can come to understand that yourself itself, your brain and so forth, is not directly in your control, although indirectly, of course, you impact it. Okay, so that's one aspect of the quality of your life, is environmental factors outside of you. The second thing is what you can do to improve your life. And there's one and only thing, and you have done it sometimes before hearing about the law of implication, but by the more time we spend together, the more you work yourself on law of implication, then, and it doesn't have to be this, like, I mean, when I say that, I mean the ideas of it, regardless of whether you directly involves interacting with me or whatever. But the thing that you do to improve your life has to do with you see something that is not good enough, and you respond by seeking understanding of how it can be either that more good can come, where you think there can be more good than there already is, or there's something bad and you're seeking to understand what it is that's bad, which is always going to involve a contradiction, always. And you're looking to see where that contradiction is and resolve it. So that's the one and only thing that you're going to do, but you can do it pervasively, of course, and while you're doing it, you're going to be increasing your life. And that's probably a pretty helpful way to help you further see what it is you can do in order to improve your life. We're constantly, there's a kind of a constant question, including one that I have, that I try to get better and better understanding, which is, well, how do I tell when my brain is, and this is almost directly off of a question that someone asked here. I'll probably even read the question in a moment, but paraphrasing it, how do I know when my brain is just running by default, right? And how do I tell the difference between what I'm doing, law of implication, so to speak, what I'm doing, what I should be doing, when I'm seeking understanding, when I'm using my consciousness or whatever. So what's going on is your brain is always running by default, and that's not necessarily a problem. There always has to be some default state, either of anything, either stillness, either the default is it doesn't exist in the first place, or it does exist and it's basically still in some way, or it's in motion in some way. But there's always going to be a default. And the word default, as I mentioned before, is a very important word that should be at the forefront of your thinking with most anything, understanding people, understanding yourself, understanding good decisions, figuring out what to do today, and so forth. That concept is critically important because you want to get more and more used to getting a sense of where things are headed by default. And including, and here's some really practical advice, not that it all isn't very practical advice, but including, you want to have a sense of when by default there's a substantial chance of failure, or even maybe a small chance of failure when you could get rid of that altogether, that sort of thing. And if there's any kind of significant, and significant can be either a high chance or a tiny chance, just depending on the situation, right? If it's like getting in a car crash, you don't want even like a 0.1% chance each time you drive, right? You want to be much less. So you, with other things, you might not be able to narrow it down that small. But if there's any kind of chance of failure that is kind of relevant or significant, then what I look to do is see, can I change the game, right? Or at least can I go outside if within the current situation, whether it be a relationship, let's say you're in a relationship and you're like, well, I hope this will work out. It looks like it's going great, but I don't know. I mean, I failed in the past and I'm not entirely sure what to do if things go wrong. Then the default is there's a noticeable chance of failure, right? And so you need to change the game in some way. You need to go outside of your existing, the default of that situation is it's predictably going to, either it's predictably going to fail, or let's say something has like a 10% chance of failure, but it's really important, like a marriage or something. Not that you can put an exact percentage, but let's just say that, or that you're just guessing and you say, well, there's like a 10% or a 50% chance of it failing. Then, and it's important, then you need to change the game, right? Like the default's that, and so you need to intervene in some way to change the default itself. You see, and that's part of what my breakthrough stacking series is, by having this concept of default at the forefront of our thinking about most anything in life, then we want to understand that we don't want to sit around struggling against where the default is. Like if a person is normally by default acts a certain way, and if we just use getting kind of angry with them or impatient, or even bribing them or just being really nice to them, another thing can happen is we meet somebody and we want them to like us, and if by default they would like us a bit but not like a huge amount, and then we try to make them like us more by putting a lot of focus or effort and doing good stuff for them and doing what they want, then the problem is the default is one way, which is that they like us a fair amount but not like overwhelmingly. And this is a huge mistake people make regarding actually both business and romantic relationships, where they struggle against a default, and then when you do that, you're always going to be needing to struggle to get that result. If the situation is contained in a certain way, if it's like a client and you just need to finish a project and then it's over, then you might not need it might not be worth trying to change the default. You might just struggle through it and be done with it. All right, then it's over. But anything ongoing, or you have to decide where to use your creativity in life. So if that's the only problem you have in life and everything else is solved, and you have a client who's difficult and it's going to end in a month anyway, you still might want to put some creativity into not having that month be difficult. If it's going to end in a month and you have other more pressing things you'd rather put your creativity into, then you do it there, right? And by creativity, it's in essence another word for seeking understanding, having, and also creativity is a couple things. Also having your brain itself work on it by the results formula shortcut, where you're picturing how the world would be after you achieve the result and feeling how you would really want that. And then that tends to get your brain focused on something in its own, using its own method. All right, sorry, let's get back from that aside though. So we don't want to struggle against default. We can't always have ideal in life, right? Sometimes there's going to be, the world is as it is right now, and there's tons of things that could be better, and we have to pick and choose what we're going to make better. So I don't mean that if there's something suboptimal in your life, you need to fight that battle right now, or you need to solve it right now. As I use the example of a client, if it's ending in a month or something, then, or even 6 months, and it's not that big of a deal, and it's suboptimal, then maybe you just struggle within that a little bit, and eat some crow once in a while and just be done with it and not make it a big deal in your life. That's fine. But you want to at least be aware of when you're struggling against default, and be aware of the difference between changing the default itself, changing the game itself. And then you kind of have to go outside the game in some way. I realize that's a little bit abstract when I say that, but I think it has some decent amount of meaning. And there can be another thing that, as we go through examples or questions, it can come up more. Okay, let me read this question itself. In my attempt at implementing LOI in my life, I can easily begin to question whether or not my methods of thought and decision-making are good and correct. So good, that's a good start. And then I'm continuing. Excuse me. You speak about how our brain will run by default and how difficult it can be to distinguish when I'm running using default thinking. So is there a method I can use to distinguish default thinking? VS, I'm not sure. Versus the proper method on a daily basis. Any suggestions on a meta method to tell the difference? And I pretty much proactively answer that to some degree. Just to a little bit recap, a little bit phrase it differently. Your brain is always using the default method of successor approximation and what's the other? Associating, right? Your brain works by making connections between things that are not inherently connected necessarily. The easiest way to see this is when you learn new words. It's like you can imagine either now or when you're an infant and you're learning new words, you learn that tree equals the word tree, right? Like the word, the way it's written or the way it sounds is attached to the concept or even a thing or whatever. The symbol is not exactly identical. Obviously, it's a symbol, right? The letters are not the same as the object, but our brain associates those things, and then it's like, okay, I learned something. So our brain, by its nature, associates things that, and it even says things match, like especially when it comes to symbols, that that aren't necessarily the same, that are not the that actually aren't the same all the time. Obviously, a symbol's not the same as a tree is an easy way to see that. So our brain functions by matching up stuff that is inherently different, and it's saying, well, these are actually all connected, or they're similar, or even the same. Or it forms conclusions like this person's great, this person's a jerk, this person's great, this person's smart, whatever. This thing is true, and it forms those conclusions without fully and properly investigating and finding out how those things definitely match. So we know that our brain does not use a method that it has some kind of filter, but that filter is nothing like a perfect method to see whether things match, or it just doesn't function that way at all. Otherwise, when we're 1 year old and our mom points at a tree and says tree and a dog and says dog, our brain would say, no, those are two different things. One's a sound and one is a like an object or an animal or a plant, and those are different, and nothing gets connected, right? And nothing matches anything else. Our brain doesn't function that way. So we want to understand and have a sense of how it functions and works. And then we want to come in and, and I have written here understanding and mismatching. And so, good, I haven't quite gotten to that. So this bridges me over to that. What we want to do to participate with our brain, and as you do this, keep in mind that at any one moment, in the present, you're basically going to be operating at the level of understanding. The quality of the ideas that are in your mind is going to be what you act on in the moment, period. And you don't really need to feel guilty about that. You just want to try to make everything better by having a higher amount of good ideas, less bad ideas over time. It seems like we can do a lot in the moment, but really that's not the case. Your brain, if you were your brain, you could do a bunch in the moment by focusing in and so forth. But you're not your brain. So consciously, you just can't do a whole lot in the moment. I can give a little bit of a backtrack or a warning on that. Even in a second or two, if you just put the brakes on something, if you realize you're about to do something that's going to pretty clearly hurt somebody else or hurt yourself, or you notice that you're heading down a route that doesn't make sense, then you could say, wait a second, hold on, and even just in doing that, you can force your brain to open something up, zoom in, look somewhere else, and then, so even in a second, sometimes you can make a good difference. But on the other hand, there's a certain truth to, at least literally in the moment, then you're operating in your current level of understanding. All right. So then what you do consciously to make things better, and in general, I say seek understanding of what's good, true, and important. But then we can ask, okay, a great question is, well, what's the nature of understanding, right? In one manner of thinking about it, that's like, it could be understood as the most important question. So something along the lines of how do we know what's true is the most fundamental question that we have to answer in life. However, let me point out that even without fully answering that question, it's great to put some good focus into that, and I have the answer to that. I've basically given it to you, but it doesn't mean that you fully have it or that I fully have it. But I've taken you pretty far if you've watched my overview and rundown series, if you've worked on it, and so forth, at least the building blocks for it. However, one of the great things about the law of implication method is that it really works well on a limited scale as well as working on kind of an ultimate scale. Like one of the conclusions about LOI is we do want to get to an ultimate scale. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense if we just stop trying to understanding before we finish. However, the great thing about the illustration of the two different math students, one of whom solves a problem well using the right method, and one of whom just kind of panics and feels like they don't understand the answer, and maybe they don't know how to do the answer, and oh no, and what do they do? Is that you can see how that the approach of solving a math problem properly is something that you can do without fully understanding the ultimate answer to how do you know what's true. There's often just about 2 steps away. Your brain kind of naturally can maybe do about 1 step, like kind of logical step away from what you're thinking. Usually it's fine with just like 1 level of justification. If you just kind of stop, and it's hard to, it's not like you're counting 1, 2 steps exactly. It's not exactly obvious what a step is, but there's a way that if we just kind of stop and say, look, what do I really know about this situation? And sort of take an inventory. And one of those things is you can know not to jump to a conclusion to start with, right? Just like if you're a detective and there's a murder scene, and there's so many different detective stories where there's the kind of silly detectives and cops or whoever jumping to conclusions, and then there's the smart detective or cop who's saying, well, I don't have a conclusion yet. I'm just noticing what's going on, and I'm starting to take account of the various evidence. I'm looking around and looking for anomalies and things that don't fit. The silly detective or cops They want to delete or marginalize anomalies and say, oh, just forget about that thing, that you noticed there on the corner. That doesn't matter. That doesn't fit in with my theory, right? So if you just behave like the smart detective or the smart math problem solver, then you can get really far. And what I talked about last live session, just by working through scenarios in your mind where you think something through more thoroughly, including like the idea of just how to achieve a goal itself, or even thinking ahead of time when you have an important or even unimportant goal or something's upsetting you, then you think, all right, let's say something comes up I didn't expect. How do I want to react with that? Do I want to get upset? Or do I want to just say, okay, well, that was always going to be reality, and I'm going to just keep using the same process of achieving my goal, where I accumulate footholds, I add things, take steps forward, whatever you want to think of it, until I get to where I'm going. When you think something through in that way, then your brain itself wasn't going to be doing that. As you do that more, your brain will actually catch on, and the default itself. Like, remember, we don't need to. Life is not really, doesn't need to be about so much a struggle, and especially where you want to be putting most of your effort in life is in changing the default of situations themselves, not struggling within the same situation. So your brain will actually get better and better at going through scenarios and thinking things through, and won't fight you on it in the same way. But let's get to the mismatching that I have right here on the slide. All right. Your brain isn't really looking for, again, mismatching. For your brain, truth is like one axon or dendrite or neuron attached to attached to another cluster, in a sense. With you, consciously, you want to start noticing how when things don't match. Even one of the things I've been thinking about this week about understanding is, let's say you go and you let's say you're trying to learn with OMG, you're watching videos, you're on live webinars, some of it makes sense, some of it doesn't. And then you go and just start trying to get your site hosted and start trying to post stuff on your website and trying to rank it for certain terms as best as you can. Then in doing that, you're building your understanding in a certain way. But there's at least a way of looking at that where so let's say you haven't poked around in WordPress at all. You're someone that's never seen that, or you've never actually gotten a site hosted. Then if you just go and do those things, then of course when you think about, then if it comes up in the future, it feels very differently tangible. I'm not sure if this is going to go somewhere that's particularly helpful for you. I apologize. This idea is really important, but the example might not. But there's a way in which you can look at it where you've narrowed down. Let's say someone's poked around in WordPress and their conclusion is, oh, I still don't understand it. Then there's a way that they're making an important mistake if they conclude that, because they have building blocks. And they also have, like, now if someone starts to explain how to do things right within WordPress, if they've poked around, even if they felt frustrated and didn't understand what was going on, then you have building blocks that are really helpful. So on a practical level, anyone who doesn't realize how big of a helpful thing it is for them to go and get started trying to do something, even if, again, this is where jumping to a conclusion is so detrimental. If someone's poking around in WordPress or trying to host a site and it's not even really working, maybe they don't even succeed in getting it hosted somehow, then there's a way in which if they feel like that was a failure, it's because they had some conclusion in their mind that was hasty about how the whole thing was supposed to end up. Instead, if you know that you're just trying to get building blocks, then practically speaking, that's all you probably really need to succeed properly with OMG. But that doesn't explain. It relates to mismatching in the following way, but I'll try to do a better job with this. You at least know more things that it isn't. Have you ever talked to someone and you were asking them about something and you knew they knew about it a bit? Maybe it's like an amount of money that they wanted to earn next year. And let's say they were saying, well, I don't have no idea how much it would be. And you're like, well, it would have to be $1 million. They would say, oh, or like, how much do you need to like get by? It would have to be $1 million now, right? So if they know that, then they know at least one thing doesn't match. If you can, if a person's never poked around within WordPress, there's just such a total blank in their mind when it's referred to, let's say by Greg. If they've poked around inside of it, even if they didn't feel like they were successful in doing so, then there's so much less wiggle room. There's so many possibilities your brain doesn't need to try and fit in there. So you've actually put a huge boundary. You've incredibly narrowed down see what your brain is doing. If you've never really seen WordPress or tried to host a site, or if you've done those things but haven't done the next step, right? Or if you've never bid on or otherwise gotten your hands, you might have just purchased one directly, gotten one from Gregory Ortiz, however, a PBN, a personal blog network site. If you've never gotten one and started poking around on one, then there's a way in which there's so many possibilities that your brain, it's so vague. And then what happens is you'll be listening to Greg or somebody and they'll be stacking on that, right? They'll be referring to a PBN and your brain has so many possibilities of what that could mean that it kind of goes into a state of confusion very quickly, right? Typically when you feel confused, it's because you're listening to or yourself is trying to build on this kind of black box, this like so many possibilities that there could be before you've seen it. Once you've poked around and tried to do it, then you so vastly narrow down what things for your brain, so it knows that so much of potential things that it could look like don't match, and you just put a big boundary. You've crossed off so much of the world. You don't even realize exactly what's going on consciously when your brain feels confused or when it's trying to put some kind of placeholder in when Greg says PBN and there's nothing tangible that your brain can latch onto. As soon as you start stacking one or two or three of those things, your brain's really going to go into an unfortunate state of confusion that it can be helpful for learning, where it particularly pays attention when you look at it, and exactly for that reason it can be helpful. But in terms of trying to understand what Greg's saying, then you're not going to understand at that time. You're just going to feel confused. So again, the benefit for the confusion is your brain is actually in a good state for getting the information if you then give it to it, if you start poking around yourself with trying to set up a PBN. But the bad part of it is that if you actually want to understand what Greg is saying, that's not going to happen in that session. So there's a way that even just having experiences, or like if someone's never swam before and then you go and try to swim, then you've narrowed down the possibilities. In one sense, you can call it a building block or a new experience. In another sense, you can see that you're actually crossing off so many potential possibilities of your brain. You now see so many things that immediately don't match. If you've never been in a pool, there might be a whole bunch of things that possibilities that theoretically you wouldn't know whether that's how it would be. And then when you try it, now those possibilities collapse into much fewer possibilities. That's not really even the main use of mismatching, but I kind of like that when I thought of it, because it kind of boils it all down in understanding potentially. I'm still working on this, which is why I'm a little bit hesitant or flopping around. And I often, one of the reasons why I put so much time in before my prepared recordings is that I usually try not to subject you to a lot of this. And on the live webinars, I also will generally try not to subject you to this too often. I think it's helpful once in a while for you to kind of get in the weeds with me, but not all the time, of course. The other idea of mismatching but it's all still mismatching. But when I say that if something changes, it can't be the same. If I say that property rights has to be, like, either there's such a thing as property rights or there's not, right? You have to pick one, right? When you have exactly two sides of a contradiction, then exactly one of those has to be true, period. And so you would think that your brain would do this on its own, but there's a way that it just doesn't. Or a group is not a decision-making entity. It can't be morally responsible for something. But it comes up constantly that people do speak as if groups need to do this and groups need to do that. I've talked about this in recordings that you might have heard. So despite the fact that that definitely doesn't match, it's definitely wrong, then you can see that brains still, like people, but I'm just saying brains still feel like it matches, feel like it makes sense. Same thing with property rights violations. Because of the issue with scarcity and static amount, property rights violations seem like they're okay to people's brains. But then you can, if you stop and see how it just doesn't match, it either has to be the case that you have some property, there's such a thing as property or there isn't. If we say there isn't such a thing as property, then the problem there is if you just take it to the extreme, that can't be right, right? Then doing anything and everything to anyone's body or money or house or car is totally fine if there's no such thing as property, and that's obviously crazy. So there's such a thing as people do need to have property. And so that has to be right. And once that has to be right, then something that does not match that has to be wrong. And that's the kind of thing that at first for many people isn't the way their brain's already configured. And so you need to look at it constantly to see how it doesn't match. And your brain's going to say, no, those things can coexist, or oh, let's just go do something else. You have a headache, or aren't you hungry, or whatever, and just try to slide around it. And what you want to do is, if it's an important topic, then, and I come back to property rights because it's just so pervasively important in your personal relationships and your business relationships. And one of the things that I probably haven't pointed out, but that's pretty huge, one of the questions on the sheet, I can put it up. The problem is it's going to put a lot of questions on the screen, but I don't care. I'll do that. Let me see here. Sorry, the interface, there's a button. I have to get to them. All right. Something where, here. Identity. You're not your mind, yourself. What's our identity? Thanks, David. I'm going to have to use LOI to forgive myself and get over anger I'm feeling. Okay, so regarding forgiving yourself, for example, there's so many things that we take on as that we're bad about. Generally growing up, however good or great or not our parents are, there's probably going to be a bunch of things we pick up on either from parents or other parts of culture where a useful kind of example just from history is the idea of being left-handed, right? Literally, there's cultures and times in the world where if someone's left-handed, then they were viewed as that was like an evil thing, all right? So, but there's plenty of instances in our current existing modern culture and locally or globally that we're told that this is bad or that's bad, and we feel guilty about this. We get angry at ourselves. And the beautiful thing about property rights, I don't know that I pointed out totally specifically yet, is that, and this relates to the idea of being able to be flexible versus solid by having distinctions. When you have the reason why morality matters so much is not because I'm sitting around trying to be on any kind of pulpit telling you to be moral or not. The reason is that there's all kinds of times when we feel bad about stuff where we don't need to feel bad, because we have not actually violated someone's property rights. If we had the idea of property rights, no one would have condemned someone that has a left hand or tied it up and forced them to use their right hand. There's people, often because of culture, not because it's at all necessary, there's anything wrong with it, then this is a modern day example. This is with homosexuality, is where I'm not aware, I've never heard an argument, and I can't think of anything myself, where there's any difference between being homosexual or being left-handed, in the sense of there's literally nothing wrong with it. It's just purely a cultural thing that's just a glitch. That's crazy to think that there's anything wrong with it. And the reason I mention this is that in practice, in actual reality, there's just millions of people that are homosexuals, and to some degree they have self-doubt. Some of them have a strong, some may not, by the way, and I don't want them to. That's why I'm saying this. But just based on the strong messages in culture, and not just strong messages, but actual people looking at them with condemnation, even if those same people are like, oh, I also look at you, I accept it, I love it. But imagine saying to someone who's left-handed, imagine if you really believe that that's evil or a curse of the devil or something, or people have thought this about red-haired people too. And if you believe that, but you say, but of course God teaches us to love you anyway. Well, that's still ridiculous, right? If someone was left-handed, I wouldn't say, okay, you're left-handed, but I love you anyway, right? I would say, dude, there's nothing wrong with me. There's literally nothing wrong. There's not just like nothing wrong, but I'm implying there is something a little bit wrong. There's literally and fully nothing wrong with it. But there's millions of people throughout the world, and in America there's probably millions, where they're homosexual, and because of all the messages and condemnation, then there's some degree of guilt that they feel. They self-doubt. Some even feel suicidal over it, and many don't. But it's just kind of tragic. And the thing about property rights is it gives us the only way that I can see to be clear on by being clear on what's wrong, then we stop. The trouble is people think so many things are wrong that aren't necessarily wrong. And separately from homosexuality, we'll just go after a goal and fail in it, and sometimes feel really angry at ourselves because we think, man, I was dumb there. I did it wrong, and I wasted all this time, and I could have made a better decision. So there's just so many examples where, property rights involve things, including other people's reputation in people's minds. You should look at that as their property, including contracts, of course, is one of the main things when we make agreements. And so honor property rights. But then if you're doing that, another thing that comes up with feeling bad, you might not even feel bad, but you might just do stuff to please other people. Like you might have friends or family who want you to do activities, and sometimes you do them, of course. But other times, if you just do it because you're going to feel guilty about not doing it, then you can go back to property rights and say, wait a second, am I violating anyone's property rights? Do I have a contract? Or even if I don't mean like to overly dramatize when I say contract. But you might have more productive hours in a day. If you just don't feel obligated for things that you actually don't have a moral obligation. But it's one thing if you feel obligated in a sense of, look, it's like a trade in essence, where we don't say it explicitly, but I do this for my allies, they do that for me. That's one thing. If it's kind of like an unspoken contract, but you're kind of honoring that might be worth it. Strategically, it might be worth it. And it might not, but it might be worth it. But if you're purely doing it for moral reasons, where you feel like you would feel guilty, and the more that you uphold this clarity about property rights, the more the people around you, close to you, will understand it, and then they won't they'll probably, because people, if you spread good ideas, actually, I'm going to hold that for a second. I'm going to finish my sentence, and then I want to come back to that, because what I'm about to say was important. But regarding just this idea of property rights, if you pervasively uphold this in your life and your thinking, then other people will start to distinguish better that you're close to, and they won't condemn you morally if you're not violating the more other people take it on around you, the better you're going to be, right? Because again, they're going to stop pressuring you or with morally, because if they see things properly themselves, and that's better. The thing with LOI that I wanted to say a couple sentences ago, the thing with LOI, the reason, one of the great powers of it is that it gets beneath all perspectives and assumptions, and you're not going to go back from it when you understand how to know what's true, right? So there's the simple idea of LOI is like the proper math student. If you want to be happy and successful, you want to get a result, then focus on what you know and realize that your brain isn't going to do that automatically. So that's the kind of simple form of it, which is very, very useful. Then there's kind of the ultimate form where if you keep focusing on what you know, then you realize that there's one and only one question that's at the very bottom of things that you must answer in order to then make progress in an ultimate and fully forward sense, which is, how do I know what's true? How do I understand it, how understanding works? That is all kind of a similar question. Once you go there, you don't go back. Once you see, even on a small level, once you see a clear contradiction, once you see how something does not match something else, you don't go back. You know, I don't know, random simple example. If a policeman or a judge or a normal person, one of those people, I should say, sees that jury duty in its current form in most or all places in the United States is a form of slavery, and it's definitely a form of involuntary servitude. Maybe it's relatively small scale, but it's still completely wrong, and we can know that by if you just did it as on a personal level to someone else. If you enslaved them in that way, you would be in a fair amount of trouble. Once you see something even like that, it doesn't match, then you're not going to go back. And so with LOI, if you convince, again, what am I doing? Changing the game, right? Changing the default itself. LOI operates at the deepest level where we fully can change the game regarding our minds. And then we can do it ourselves, but then as we spread it, then other people can do it for themselves. But they're not going to go back. And that's why it's a credible way to, quote unquote, save the world even. Because if people aren't going to go back from it, then we get the people that are closer and we get them over the line. You know, we get them to see certain things, how certain things don't match, certain contradictions, and resolve them. And then we're not going to go back from that. And then as you get more people seeing that, it's going to bring other people closer as well, and then more people will get over the edge with it and so forth. But by the fact that it's not that we're struggling against default. With most any other ideology, it's a struggle, meaning that it's not, the ideology is not absolutely understood, and so people can adopt it, but there's also problems with it. They'll rebel against it at some point, sometimes, with almost any religion or philosophy or political philosophy, it just kind of reaches a certain point and then it stops on spreading, and then it has a backlash because of the imperfections in it, right? The imperfections in the kind of original conservatism and so forth of America, and the backlash you end up with liberalism, you know, and so forth. And if they had gotten their ideas straight to begin with, then they wouldn't have needed the backlash in the same way. All right. Okay, let me just put the other slide back on so we don't have a lot of random questions on the screen. All right, let me look for some other, let me see what's going on recent. Thank you. When I was struggling a bit there, someone said it's all helpful, David. I appreciate that. The latest question I have here is, will you please use law of implication method of thinking to describe the law of attraction? I talked about an illustration last recording, live webinar, to help to understand the law of attraction. Let me see what I can do. It's a great it's a kind of question. I think it's a great question. Actually, it's cool because when I was building OMG, this relates to another question that I mentioned earlier, then I used the idea of the law of attraction pretty significantly. But what you want to do is use law of implication in conjunction with the law of attraction. You see, the law of implication, there's the main idea about focusing on what you know. Then there is the methodology of thinking in scenarios and focusing on mismatching, resolving contradictions, and and understanding the difference between seems and is, and your conscious field and so forth. If that is new to you, then go through the rundown and overview series, especially around video recordings like 9, 10, and 11 and so forth. But that method, you see, with the law of attraction, you have the idea that kind of the level at which you operate regarding your mind and your thoughts is the level at which you attract into your life, right? I believe that's a pretty fair version of the law of attraction. What you focus on, the level of your thoughts, that's what you're attracting things into your life. The law of implication shows you how to increase the level of your thoughts. Now, you're never keeping a scorecard in which you're worrying about being superior to either yourself or other people, or relating or relative to like a standard or something like that, or a norm. But you increase your level of your ideas by first and foremost resolving contradictions. And one of the most important contradictions has to do with getting rid of the idea of scarcity in your mind. If you have this idea that there's a static amount, then you need to change the game. If you think, okay, look, I have 4 months to learn OMG and succeed with it, then you've created a static situation. And then someone might object and say, well, what do I do? Just give it an infinite amount of time? Well, here's what you do, is you, the way that you get into an abundant or a situation, or you don't need to try to get into abundance. What you need to do is get out of where there's a static amount of the good that you need. Between now and October, what is this, August, September, October, between this day in October, there's 2 months, right? There's about 60 days. So defined that way, there's 60 days, right? You multiply it by 24 and you get whatever that is in terms of hours. So that's static. But if so we can always define something in terms of static. Or you always, on any day you have 24 hours in a day. That's true. But you can understand a task or something you're trying to accomplish. You can almost always get rid of the deadline if you reframe it in a certain way. So what you can say is, look, I want here's an example of how someone might do it with OMG. They might say to themselves, I want to make sure I have a stable base, and I can't necessarily depend, when I'm starting out with OMG, I can't necessarily depend that OMG is going to put food on my table in 15 days or tomorrow. I hear again, I'm speaking from the perspective of a new OMGer. So, I hear that some people do succeed within 2 months, but also maybe I've heard David say that if someone is succeeding within 2 months, they at least tend to have a fair amount of background. Their environment just tends to be particularly suited to succeeding quickly. So, and I just say that so you don't blame yourself if you don't. It's just not relevant how fast someone else succeeds, except that overall, if you, it's very possibly the case that if you just take a general look at OMG and how it's all structured and all the success that comes out of it, plus just the whole way as I said, the way it's structured, where you have constant access, or consistent, I should say, consistent access to successful, caring people who are really showing you what they're doing. Plus you have a tremendous amount of training from those same people that's already recorded. Plus you have the Facebook group, and then you have Mike's emails, and so between all of that, you have law of implication in here and everything. Then, just like committing to a pretty great romantic partner, then you can say it's a lot like meeting a romantic partner that's like, wow, this person's pretty great, right? Pretty awesome. There's no one that I've really met that comes particularly close. If that's your sense of OMG, which it reasonably could be, then it's reasonable to commit. And then what you do is you couple that with getting time on your side, where you have some kind of stable base of income, presumably a job or whatever, or maybe your own business, you have something going on okay, and then maybe you cut down on your spending just to make sure that you're not in a pinch. And one way or the other, you just say, all right, this is worth committing to. I'll make sure that I can put food on the table, and then I'm going to focus in and make this work. And also OMG is general enough and open-ended enough that within that framework, you can make something work pretty great. I mean, we're talking about putting up a website that gets visitors and then does something with those visitors. Something within that arena, if you're going to be doing any kind of working for yourself at all, you're going to want that ability, right? So you can check it from a number of angles and see, hey, it makes sense. I'm not really going to take myself out or screw myself by committing. And then let me just get time on my side. So that's an example of how you take a thing that was kind of artificially static, like, okay, I want to make sure I see results within 4 months, and instead turn it into something where it's not so static. Another thing that can look static is in a relationship, if there's a particular person that you think that you want, right? Then if they're just not that into you, then it's only artificial that there's just other people out there. And even if there weren't other people, there's just other things you can do in your life that are also nice and good. So one particular good can be limited, but you don't need one particular good in order to have lots of happiness, right? There's all sorts of potential opportunities. Another place where things can be static has to do with a particular niche, where what isn't static when you're making any kind of business for yourself, or even if you're working for somebody else, is value that you bring to the table, right? You're creating something when that's the case. And so, by the way, whenever you feel kind of depressed, or even on a particular day, if you wouldn't call it depression, but you wake up or you're feeling kind of like life is kind of difficult, or you're feeling a little panicked, you don't even know why, that sort of thing, it's always because there's an assumption of scarcity that's bubbling up. It's a symptom of believing that time is ticking down for some reason, or something is running out, or there's or that there's an overall race, and you would have picked this up in school very possibly, as well as other places when you were younger, is that there's kind of this race that you're in with other people in the world, and oh my gosh, maybe they're pulling ahead. Like while you're sleeping or doing this, like every day they're pulling ahead, and you better be at least keeping up with them. Well, there's only a race if there's a static amount of good stuff, don't you see? There isn't a race. There's no competition. One of the reasons I talk about there's no competition. Competition assumes static, a static universe of good stuff where there's only a certain amount of good stuff. Well, there's no one to compete with if you can just create good stuff or find more good stuff by looking that really wasn't there except until you looked for it, in a sense, like you almost create it by looking. In a manner of speaking, then there's just no race. There's no competition. There's no need to believe in yourself. There's no reason to feel superior or worry about whether you're not too far behind other people or if you're ahead of them. Then there's less reason to judge other people. But if you look, always this sense of unease, it's going to be related to static and this idea of a static amount of good stuff. And it's not like obvious, but you have to dig and you'll find it. Someone asked if the sound cut out. I'm hoping it didn't. I presume it didn't. Let me see here. I'm not sure. Usually I feel like I see something with my mic. Sound is good. Okay, good. All right, good. All right, let me make sure I didn't... I was talking about law of attraction. Let me make sure that I dealt with that decently. So I gave a reasonable answer so far. If you haven't heard my last recording, make sure you hear it, where I give the illustration of receptors on a cell in a bloodstream, like a cell in your body, and that if you think of like the level you're thinking as receptors and so forth, and then there's the environment, there's hormones bouncing around. In real life, it's like there's people, there's opportunities, and so forth. But yeah, and then I segued in. That's where I segued in into the idea of the static amount. Is fundamentally, this is where you can see what you're going to attract. The more you get out of the mindset that there's a static amount of stuff, the more you stop creating, artificially stipulating and creating situations like that for yourself and believing in them. When you believe that there's a static amount of stuff, it is not a self, it's kind of funny. or maybe not funny, but it's not even a self-fulfilling prophecy. What's interesting is you get actual waste. When you think that there's a static amount of good stuff, what you'll get out of that is bad. All right? And again, think of it in a romantic relationship. Bad leads to bad. If you think that there's not like a certain amount of goodwill and good feeling and happiness between the two of you. If you treat it like there is, then you act like there's no big deal to just snap at someone or give them a bad look or something like that, right? And the reason you feel like snapping or giving a bad look in the first place is because there's another way in which you are thinking that there's a static amount of good stuff and they were getting in your way of it, you know? So you can take advantage of the law of attraction by rooting out this belief in a static amount. And it's not like you as a person believe in abundance or don't. It's going to be intertwined. You can have contradictions and different contradictory beliefs in your own mind, in different arenas in life, in different situations. They can all be interwoven. The reality is abundance and waste and potential waste. All right? Potential abundance, potential waste in existence. It's always the case that if there's a static situation, you can ultimately break out of it. It's not the ultimate rules of how things work. It's part of why it's ultimately going to be helpful. I don't think I'm going to get to it in this recording, but I'll get to it soon, where I'll go over again the proof of understanding that God exists. Because if you generally understand that God exists and have a general understanding of how existence works and kind of a background scale like that, then it'll help to get rid of this idea of there being a static amount of good stuff. And one last comment, just be very careful when you're believing in the law of attraction. Don't worry, or you're not looking to feel bad that something bad came in your life. It's not like, yeah, it means you didn't filter it out in a sense, but accept that there's going to be bad ideas and contradictions in your mind right now. And you're going through a journey of rooting them out. And so you're going to end up with some bad stuff, and don't blame yourself for that. However, and here's another great use of the idea of property rights. If somebody violates your property rights, then that gets outside of the law of attraction. That's the kind of thing you can't filter out properly, like as far as I can tell. It's just a sort of automatic lose situation when someone violates someone else's property rights. You didn't attract that necessarily to yourself. If someone, I can think of situations where maybe you somehow played a part in it, but just for now, I'll work on this some more, but I'm pretty certain that that's one of the reasons why the property rights idea is very important, is because it goes outside of however good your ideas are. If someone's just going to violate your property rights, shoot you in the head or just take your money in your bank account, that sort of thing, then again, that kind of lies almost outside of the law of attraction. However, this world itself is not the ultimate and the end all be all of reality. And so once again, we're not locked in ultimately to being stuck with other people violating us on an ultimate scale. Let me read the next question here. Do you think it's perfectly reasonable to prioritize LOI over any and all activities if we stipulate the only exceptions on priority would be circumstances needing immediate attention, such as ill health? That's another great question. Let's see. Here's the best I can do in my life. I'm aware of this issue, this question, and I kind of deal with it myself. In terms of directly trying to work on ideas, as opposed to there's a way that you of course always want to. All right, I know I'm interrupting myself a little bit here. All right, there may be some limit to. Our brain might almost like literally need to recharge. This is pushing up a little bit against the limits of my own, what I've figured out myself. But there's one way of understanding what it means to focus on LOI that doing it kind of like your entire waking day is not necessarily fully realistic. But there's another way. This is where we can kind of look at extremes on both ends and and kind of prove that the answer lies somewhere in the middle, which is not always the case in life, but it sometimes happens, such as in other cases where the answer lies somewhere in the middle of, like, are you all-knowing? No. However, are you aware of nothing? No. You're aware of something, right? Another place where the answer lies in the middle is, do you need like 10 trillion zillion dollars? No. But do you need more than $1? Yeah. So you need some amount of money that's in between. The same, it seems like, with focusing on LOI. Probably you can find a way to focus on it in some way for like a few hours a day. And more than that might be fairly unrealistic. However, if you're in a position financially and just generally with your life and it works for you to just really be looking at it for even 10 hours or 6 hours or 12 or 16 hours in a day, then try it. See how it's working for you. I mean, certainly that can just accelerate you forward and give you some massive action to break you through. I would certainly poke around with it and see where you're at with it. It's hard, and then it's hard to know. Some things are a little bit of a gray area, like when I'm working on when I'm working on OMG. I definitely took a couple of years stopping, maybe, I don't know, several months ago or something, but where I was very focused on making sure OMG kind of fully got off the ground and was working well as part of my whole plan. So sometimes you're going to have projects that might take a certain essay amount of focus. Some of us have jobs where, in order to do the job, right, we have to show up a certain amount, and we might need to put some extra time into a certain amount to keep the job at all. So there's certain thresholds we have to get over. But there's a way in which I did the whole time when I was focused on OMG. I wanted to get it broken through where I could spend a little less focus directly on it and more focus both on developing and also sharing the LOI ideas, which now I can do more. So sometimes you might need to get caught up in other things in life. However, most anything can form a little bit of an example or a place where you're going to be better off, certainly using the ideas from LOI. So that gave you a little bit of my thinking. I wish I understood so well that I can give you a particularly great answer to that, but at least that gives you some sense. But a lot of these answers, or me working through some of these things, it continues to illustrate that you don't need to, you can make progress without having something in the center of your page, so to speak, with a conclusion, right? So sometimes I don't even know an answer, but I give you a number of things that we can know, and then that takes us forward. And then at some point we can have a final answer, but we don't need to feel like we've done something wrong. As a matter of fact, we're doing something right if we don't leap to an answer that we haven't built properly until it gets kind of built for itself, or not for itself, but built properly, basically. It kind of fills itself in, I say. In a sense, it's a yes or no question, and I could say yes. One more time. Do you think it's perfectly, this is the question, do you think it's perfectly reasonable to prioritize LOI over any and all activities if we stipulate the only exceptions and priority would be circumstances needing immediate attention? So the answer is yes, I do think it's perfectly reasonable. There's a different question of, I kind of answered a more open-ended question in my rest of my answer, but it certainly is reasonable. Let's see what we got here. You say scarcity doesn't exist and how it's so vitally important to understand why that is. Is there a moral issue then when implementing scarcity tactics to make a sale? Why not? That's a cool thing. All right. Let's see. Generally with morality, we're looking at property rights. And the simple answer is I would say no, there's not a problem with using scarcity to make a sale. I wouldn't be deceptive about it, because when you're deceptive, that's in essence bordering or fully a property rights violation. Because when you're making a sale, it's like a contract, right, between two people, where your offer is what you're offering, and then the money that they're giving you and whatever else is what they're giving in response. So you are being dishonest with a contract if you're dishonest in your sales process. There's a way in which you need to take kind of the world as it is and work with people's minds as they are, where like there's a general, to answer also kind of or to make a more general point, which is helpful. I interact with people understanding, the more you understand the default way that brains operate and accept it, I basically expect people to operate on sort of a default level, but I don't encourage it, right? With LOI is my way of showing people how to operate outside of the default. But then as I said, I generally expect and operate as people operating within the default. And scarcity is like the most effective sales mechanism there pretty much is. I mean, like if something isn't going off sale, then, but what I try to do is I try to find some, if someone needed something for some reason, if it was an absolute need or they couldn't be happy or whatever, then I would be certainly looking to find a way to not have it be scarce at all. And that's the case, by the way, with LOI, is I am not looking to have it be limited in various ways. Anyhow, but, you know, with a product, people can live without it, right? And if they're not buying it yet, they can live without it. So if you have some kind of scarcity, what I do look for is on a practical level, I look for sort of natural scarcity. The most obvious is if there's an actual live event, then people have to register or pay for it before the event. If there's, and then there's other reasons why things might need to close with live webinars, or just closing registration for a little while to take care of your customers. I try to just not have it be totally artificial if possible. But no, basically no. I as far as I can tell, as long as you're not dishonest about it, then I wouldn't. I don't see a moral issue. And I would actually, for conversion purposes, if you look for natural scarcity, then that's a pretty smart thing to do. But now I don't really try to create it out of thin air because that can that kind of a backlash. Let's see what we got here. Got a number of questions from the same person. On a previous recording, you mentioned that if someone could see life through your eyes for 1 minute or so, they would have, after experiencing your mind, paid $1 million to see life through your eyes. Can you expand on that? It's a very large claim. I'd love to hear more about it. Let's see. It's totally a good question. Let me see if anything comes to mind. Okay, so if someone could see through my eyes, what would it be like? And when I say paying 1 million, yeah, I mean, again, that's reasonable. Even so many years ago, I remember I was talking to Mike, and we were walking on the campus of UVA, where we lived in Charlottesville, Virginia. And even what I discovered back then, we both felt like for sure if we could trade, if we had to choose between what I even understood then of the law of implication, we just called it the method back then. We didn't have the brand name law of implication, but we would want that or all the knowledge of the professors there at UVA, then we felt like it would be a no-brainer. So why would that be? Well, I think it has to do with realizing the importance of knowing how to know what's true. And then knowing how to know that, knowing that God exists, actually knowing it. There's just such a difference between, you're probably experiencing it to some degree, a lot of you, if you see how certain things don't match, and they clearly don't match, then you understand something, right? Like even this scarcity thing, or maybe what we talked about last time about how to go about with goals, and how if we work through a scenario of how we might want to go about goal achieving, and we see it doesn't make any sense if there's an unexpected obstacle that comes in, if we think about, do I want to just get upset and feel angry at myself or someone else, or and be inefficient if that happens, or do I think that I'll be a happier, more effective and a person if I just keep on building towards a breakthrough to achieve a result, without and take the world as it is, and then seek from there, seek good, how to get to my result from there. And who would I want as an employee? Same thing. Would I want someone that took what came and kept on trying to make things better and get to a result, and accumulating building blocks until they had a breakthrough, that sort of thing? Or do I want someone just to kind of get all upset and frustrated when things don't turn out just the way they hope or expect it? Then we can see how one matches and one doesn't match, right? Clearly it doesn't match to function in that way, where we just get upset if there's an unexpected obstacle or something, or if something's more difficult than we expect, or we don't get the result that we expected, that whole way of operating. When we see how that doesn't match, then we have a piece of understanding or knowledge. When you see one thing does not match something else clearly. And it gives us, we won't go back. We have a certain confidence from that. And as we start to stack more and more things onto that, when we understand property rights and we see how that matches or doesn't match, if we don't look at it that way, if we realize that the world is not static, that any time that we feel bad or a little panicked or a little scared or whatever, and then if a few times when that happens, we think it through, and we do notice where we were creating or believing in an artificial piece of scarcity, of staticness and scarcity, and then we change that around in our minds, and then we create and we feel better and we are more effective. It's not just feeling better, but then when we are more effective, and then as in our personal relationships, when we are operating in this way, where we're seeking understanding, creating abundance, and our relationships, we attract better people, our relationships are very happy. If you can get in my head, it would be like I wake up in the morning, and at this point in my life, I can do what I want to have. I have some responsibilities, of course, but typically I feel quite good. If I don't, then I work through it pretty quickly, and within almost seconds, I kind of spot the issue. Another issue that comes up is our brain just tends to extrapolate, and if we haven't been productive for like half a day or a day in the way that it thinks, then it'll feel like, oh no, the walls are closing in a little bit. And so then if you just go do something, then that goes away once you realize that. Also, as you realize that more and more, then you don't even have the feeling, it just, you can kind of, doesn't really come up in the first place. But there's and this is very different than how it used to be for me. There's a calmness and a happiness that I have. And then when I want results, there's a way that it's not about a struggle, and then I'll generally get them using just the same exact things I'm always talking about, right? Where I just go about it, where I'm not concerned if I know how to get a result. I realize I often don't know what the answer is or how to get a result, and that's pretty normal when you're working for yourself, right? But it can feel uncomfortable for people often to not know what the answer is or how to accomplish a result they feel like they need to get, or if you have a client, you don't know how to rank a website, but they have a client who's paying you to do it. But then the more you're used to using the method where you just start building on what taking an inventory of what you know, looking around for more things you can know, building on that, realizing that your brain doesn't think things through as scenarios and then doing it on purpose instead. And then you get more and more results and things in place in your life. Another way to put it is the default way that so much of the things in my life at this point, and didn't always used to be this way, of course, are heading is everything's just on such a nice track. And I don't mean that a disaster couldn't hit. And again, someone certainly could violate my property rights. It would pretty much take that at this point to have any kind of significant setback. But that can happen. but there's such a like in every way that I look at my life, time is basically on my side. And for the most part, of course, today I scheduled a webinar to help people and to help myself learn, understand better and so forth, move things forward, law of application. But other than something like that I schedule, for the most part, if I wake up in the morning and do nothing all day, I'm pretty much ahead of where I was in the morning because just the natural things that are in motion and all over in my life are in pretty good shape. Of course, I spend some time with my family. If I don't, obviously no one can ignore their family for days or weeks, or wouldn't want to in the first place. But I don't know. That's just again some kind of pieces or building blocks of how it all comes together. And then ultimately the value of it is just immense. There's really I don't know that someone who either had money, they would pretty much want to buy feeling like I feel, I think. Because people can have highs for sure and they can come across as they're happy, but people tend to have a lot of bad moments too, and I really don't these days. And again, that's very different. People that know me on a day-to-day basis, I'm pretty calm and happy pretty consistently. Things will, I no way am I perfect right now, but the level of it is really like pretty high compared to what I think people normally experience. So if someone was wealthy, I think they would want to buy that. And if they weren't wealthy, they would want to buy being able to get results and have the level of business relationships that I know how to have by operating in the way that I do. If someone, doesn't have a particularly good romantic relationship, then they would know exactly how to have it if they can get into my head. And I try to explain all this stuff. I'm not trying to keep it in my head. But that's maybe a bit of what I meant. Mostly I was trying to motivate people, as I said, to stick with me. It all flows from the one question of how do we know what's true? And then we build from there. Of course, since we have LOI for less than $1 million, then you might not want to pay $1 million for it for that reason. So that would be one exception to that idea. Here's another question. Isn't proposing scarcity when you know it's non-existent being dishonest? Yeah, and this is the same person that asked the previous. Here's how I do it. When I make something scarce, it's because it's an opportunity, and I don't say this is your only opportunity for good in your life. If I was going to say that, I would not make it scarce, and vice versa. So even if I close down the sale of some LOI thing, which I generally don't do in the first place, but if I did, I think someone could make a case that I've done that in some way, shape, or form. I could maybe dispute that, but anyway. But then I'm not done. I'm going to keep going with LOI. So they're going to have some other opportunity to learn from me with LOI. So the reason why it's not immoral to create some good, some piece of value, some product, and then say, I'm going to stop selling this product tonight at midnight, is because there's other opportunities that people have for a good. If for some reason people totally needed it, and they knew they needed it, then they'd be buying it anyway. If they didn't know they needed it, then maybe it would still help them to take it off sale and then put it back on sale later, and that would get them consuming it. So that gives some indication of why I would say it's not immoral. But basically, because there isn't scarcity, with any particular product or good, there's just lots of opportunities in the world. Of course, individual things there can be only a certain amount of certain goods or products or people's time. But then if you can't get your hands on that, or if someone else really wants it and you want to let them have it instead, then you just can go do something else, right? There might be a certain number of seats at a restaurant or a parking space in a parking lot, and maybe you just go say, hey, I don't actually mind taking a walk today. I would enjoy here's just a simple example of getting outside of static stuff. There's a parking lot. It's nearly full. It's going to be full. That a lot of people are going to feel really happy if they can just get a spot in that parking spot. You think, hey, could I feel just as happy or even happier if I parked a little farther away and took a walk? Maybe you would. Or maybe you're sitting at a restaurant and you would feel happier getting up and letting someone else have your seat and you're done, like not like a sit-down place that logistically wouldn't make much sense to have to clear your table and stuff. But of course, you could leave earlier rather than later because of that, to give someone else a chance. And maybe you just feel happy doing that and sharing. So then there was, there's a certain amount of one resource, but you're perfectly happy just letting someone else have it, and you can just go do something else with your day that would make you equally happy. Plus, then you get the happiness of letting someone else have the other good. So you just go outside the game. Oh, that's so nice. Another amazing session, David. Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you. I feel like I'm a little less sharp today, but it just kind of fluctuates. Literally, even things like blood sugar, I try to watch it and try to eat mostly protein and so forth, and so forth. And I try to drink coffee at just the right time beforehand. But I don't think I think I'm about an hour and a half short on the amount of sleep that makes me sharpest. But the problem was I think I need to just buy an actual alarm clock. Would you believe I've functioned without an actual alarm clock for like 20 years or something? But I think I would have slept better today. I woke up around 9 a.m., went to bed around 2. And I one thing I know from myself currently and for my whole life, basically, that if I don't get 8.5 hours, then I'm not as sharp as if otherwise. Okay, here's a little bit of a challenging question here. David, that was a wimpy response to the question about scarcity, in quotes, as a motivation tool in the sales process, frequently used by marketers, and scarcity is used as an alternative to an abundance view of the framework of life itself. Isn't there a conflict here? And I think, again, the objection or the conflict is between, like, aren't these scarcity tactics just not really right? Well, and I kind of get this question may or may not. I don't necessarily think that what I said previously would have fully satisfied this person, but it might have. But they might have written it before. I don't know. I'm not getting there where I see that there are certainly scarcity tactics that in practice, absolutely, I've refused myself. And I've said, no, I'm not going to deceive people and say there's only a certain amount when there isn't. I've said that unless there's a natural form of scarcity here, I'm not going to use a scarcity tactic. But at the same time, because it converts so well, let's suppose that, just take OMG. Let's suppose that I think that OMG helps people, presuming that it's something that they generally are a prospect for and want in the first place. But most anyone who's going to buy because of scarcity is generally going to be someone who's interested in this topic, right? Who's going to be helped by OMG, and theoretically. Let's say we stipulate, just for a second. It doesn't make it true that I stipulate it, but it does make it true for the mental exercise. Suppose we stipulate that if I find a sort of natural form of scarcity, where it's hard to organize it sometimes if we don't close it down at times, or sometimes the affiliates themselves will just have an end point to their bonus because they that's just how they choose to do things. Let's stipulate that twice as many people will buy if we do something like that than otherwise. I'm not saying that's actually true, but then if it was going to help them, so that means let's just say that this isn't what twice as many is for OMG, but let's just pick a number. Let's just say 500 more people in a given promotional period or several month period will buy. And then if we stipulate that, and then if we stipulate, also this doesn't make it true, just stipulating that OMG is helpful to people that are generally prospects for it, then now that's 500 more people that have gotten something that was helpful for them. And instead their brain might have just kept them from buying it based on other wrong ideas. Part of the sense of scarcity comes from, part of what it does is help resolve the issue for people when they have some doubts or they want to put it off and so forth. So I think being dishonest about it is literally wrong because it's violating a contract. It's fudging with contracts, and contracts are an important part of property rights. But do I think that, and if let's say an affiliate says, I'm going to only offer my bonus until Friday at midnight, do I think that's immoral? No, I don't think that's immoral, as long as they're basically true. There's I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can say about that. Nothing's coming to mind, but I'm sure something will come to mind later. But not everything comes to mind at the moment. And then there's a second thing regarding jury duty, and this reminds me also of a different question someone had from the previously that I have saved up. Also, you see jury duty as servitude rather than a civic responsibility within our society. There is a difference between taking and giving. See if he continued this question. And maybe, sorry, that might, I think there's a comma there. Oh, maybe. Let me see if I'm not seeing here. No, that's the whole thing. All right. So basically the question is, hey, you're seeing it as involuntary servitude, which is prohibited by the 13th Amendment, except that it's expressly made legal by the Supreme Court if they're able to do such a thing. In a few years after that, as long as it's done by the government. Anyhow, he's saying that, David, but how about, is it your civic duty? Well, this is where thinking through in scenarios it is a beautiful place to illustrate thinking through in scenarios. And so whether or not this question, whether the topic itself is interesting for everyone, it's probably interesting for many people, but in case it's not, it's still a great place to just illustrate the thinking process itself. So when I had jury duty recently, a few weeks ago, a policeman said to me that I should do it because it's my civic duty. That is literally impossible for me to do. See, in order to do something because it's my civic duty, I need to basically believe that it's my civic duty. So I can't do it. I'm not sure how clear I am about this. I can't. I don't believe that's. I don't. And so I need to separately explain why I don't believe it's my civic duty. However, but currently, if I don't think it's my civic duty, I can't do it because it's my civic duty. The reason I did jury duty was because the cops threatened to come and arrest me if I didn't. All right, so that was my reasoning. And then once I was there at jury duty, then I followed their orders, which I would have followed up until the point where I would violate another person's property rights. So I wouldn't follow any orders for this reason if they violated someone else. But I followed their orders so they wouldn't hurt me, which would also have bad impact on my family and OMG, what if they imprisoned me and so forth. So, so the question is there such thing as like a civic duty? And this is why property rights is such an important concept, because we need a way to tell when I need to do something and when I don't. And without having clarity about property rights, then people just start making stuff up. So let's just say there's a random person, they walk up to me and they say, you need to shine my shoes because it's your civic duty. Then we wouldn't say I should do that, right? So now let's say a cop said, you need to shine my shoes because it's my civic duty. You still wouldn't say that that was your civic duty. So then it's not just because the cop says it. It must be because I have some sort of obligation. It must be, again, because, but then I'm trying to figure out where that is. Let's say another good thing to do with this scenario is, again, if someone's telling me that I should do something other than what I would normally do, they're trying to get me off of my default, right? So it's the burden of proof is certainly on the other person, right? Is that fairly obvious that if you walk up to someone and tell them, if you don't do X for me, if you don't perform some service, that's immoral, you're violating morality, then I need to be able to explain why it's moral. And that explanation needs to get all the way to the core. I can't just say, oh, because some people would be helped, therefore I'm supposed to do such and such. Because that doesn't, the idea that I should perform a service because it would help somebody else, that fails one of my tests just on my one clear slide about the method. Let me bring that up for a second. I'm going to pause showing my screen for a second. I'm still here. I'm just finding the slide with all of the, let's see here. Okay. Okay. Did I have it backwards there with paused? Okay, now I'm showing my screen. And I might have always been, whatever. Doesn't matter. Nothing was bad on there. So this is just the slide that I used in my overview and rundown series that, sorry, I can't see it myself very easily with the way that GoToWebinar works. The question box is also in my way. And I kind of want to keep it in my way so I can see it. But these are the ingredients to, or at least these are words that can serve as kind of indications or placeholders or something for the ingredients of how the method for thinking clearly and understanding what's true. So if someone's gonna tell, what I was saying was it fails the test of the extreme test. A true statement, here I write, the true statement must always be true. So check at the extremes for wrongness. So if someone says, look, you need to do this service because it's going to help a bunch of people, then the problem with that is that that can be used to make anyone do anything all the time, which just gets a little ridiculous, right? By the idea of that, we could just force doctors to perform their service for free, or just anyone to do anything because, or most anything that might help somebody else. In the specific case of jury duty, what I was apparently doing that was going to be helping someone, just to show how you could, just to show how minute, how small it was, so that to show how crazy we can get with this if we could just order people to do something. I was kind of in the audience, so to speak. I was part of a pool from which other people were picked at random, not myself. I mean, I could have been picked at random, but I wasn't, to go and be interviewed for jury duty, and then I would sit there and listen to the questions, basically. And then, the case itself was not a violation of property rights. It was someone was accused of promoting prostitution, and so and then I just had to listen, and then I was dismissed. And I had to wear pants, by the way. It's the summer, and I had to go dig out some pants, humorously enough. I don't know if I'd be arrested or what if I showed up there in shorts. Apparently, not only was my civic duty to show up and do nothing, but it was my civic duty to wear pants while doing it. So the idea that merely because it helps someone else that I can be forced, that we can force something. So then what's your civic duty at that point? And it just kind of boils down into nothing. An easy way to see stuff when it comes to government type or even any kind of property rights questions is imagine you're on an island with like 10 people, and then 6 of them get together and they decide to make a bunch of rules, not you, and then they're like, okay, well, we're the government and here's the rules. All those rules are now those rules could separately be correct, but they'd only be correct not because those people are government. They'd be correct because of the law of implication, essentially, because they'd be correct for some fundamental foundational reason. But if they're like, here's the rule, here's the guidelines by which we're going to decide whether to use violence or not. And again, if those guidelines were exactly right, then that would be fine. But if even one of them is wrong, then the people would be using violence at the wrong time. So no, I don't see jury duty as the only duty I would have would be if I made a contract with somebody else. Even if someone just does something wonderful for me, I'm not obligated to do something in response. Just like if Hare Krishna gives me a flower or a book, I'm not obligated to give them money. So no, there's no social contract, because the way a contract works is always that contract law is pretty basic and understandable. 2 people of sound mind, right, have to agree on something, and there has to be an exchange of value. And so I never agreed to do jury duty. it was definitely involuntary servitude. Let me see where I am here. Oh, that's very nice. Trust me, we can't tell. I appreciate that about my not being as sharp as I would like to be. So much inspiring and with a lot of depth on all you share with us. Thanks. I appreciate that. Okay, let me see if we have a question. Oh, I was going to say just quickly, I know I don't want to, I try to limit how much I talk about public policy type stuff, but I think there was here. One thing you can't see is I need to move the question box out of the way so I can see some of the stuff in the background. This person's question. They had a question about failure questions, which is pretty cool. I'll maybe take a second on that in a moment. But then they said, isn't extortion giving money without getting anything in return? What is your take on paying tax and getting our rubbish removed, roads fixed, medical treatment for all? As a practical matter, if taxes were extremely low and it was really used with respect and efficiency, then I would pick other ideological battles in life, if that makes sense. Like, so there's lots of things to fix in the world, and I wouldn't pick that as one of my top ones. As it is in America, for example, which is where I live, then taxation is an immense problem, and ultimately it's behind the. On like kind of a local level, people are nice and polite, and they don't dislike each other. But there's a lot of anger and hatred in America. There's a lot of issues that people have with immigration, legal or illegal. There's a big distinction between the two in a lot of people's minds, and I understand that. I'm not conflating that in other people's minds. However, there's a general there's a lot all around, and absolutely not on quote unquote one side or some other side, but all over the place. The ripple effects of taxation and the massive level of taxation, the massive waste and corruption of it in America, that is a huge issue, because right at the center, people could argue it's not the center of our lives, but it's a big, huge thing that affects our daily lives, and it's all over, where there's property rights being violated. And once that's the case, it has all these ripple effects. It's a little bit related to like the idea of broken windows of crime. There's why should anyone respect property rights when you have the government violating it so massively, taking around half of what someone makes in a year? And again, it's throwing it all over the place. It's as if America's been invaded and forced to pay tribute by virtually every country, right? The money goes all over to different countries as what is effectively tribute to like virtually every other country, and it's just just you can go on and on and on and on with the unbelievable waste and corruption of it. Even when it's supposedly building stuff, it's still going in the pockets of developers and people that are cronies and such, and then they get kickbacks back to and then there's a whole process. So on a practical level, if it wasn't such an important thing with ripple effects that way beyond just what's obvious, where it really destroys the psyche of Americans in so many ways, then but the ripple effects are really horrendous. And for the sake of not going on and on and on about taxes, I'm not going to get into more than I just did, but I gave an indication of it. And then separately, there's a simple answer of no, of course it's extortion. If I go over to my neighbor, point a gun at their kneecap and say, give me $50,000 tomorrow, it's going to be $50,000. It's going to have interest, and I'm going to pull the trigger. Then that's extortion, right? And that's what the government does to us. Then if I then go and spend some or all of that money on something that maybe is of some benefit to some guy or even to that person, it's still totally wrong. It's still extortion. And in fact, when I pay like $500,000 in taxes in a year, or that's only vaguely related to what I pay. But if I pay something in that neighborhood, I get basically two things for that: jack and squat. What they keep the Canadians from rampaging across the border. I'm kidding, of course, right? So it's protection money to what? Keep me from being invaded by somebody And then what else? I'm not sure what else. Whatever else. They make sure my health insurance gets canceled, which it got canceled. My plan was declared illegal by the federal government. That's what I get for my money. So that's not what's going on. It's not getting. If you live in a place where tax money is being spent on something that benefits you, then I congratulate you on that. In America, that's not anywhere near the case. What you pay in local taxes can be a lot less than federal, and you get basically nothing for your federal taxes, which are above 40% in America. Okay, that's enough on that, but I just wanted to mention that. And this is the kind of thing where just by working through scenarios, you can get the answer to this pretty quickly. And it's just another example of you just start to think things through. You take a scenario, keep it simple. If you're trying to think of government, just imagine an island with 10 people and go from there. And remember just simple things like if someone says maybe it's a contract, then you say, well, wait a second, let me just think, what's a contract? And obviously it's pretty fast when you think of a contract to realize that it's two parties that have to agree to it. There's no such thing as like you can't say to your neighbor, by virtue of you living in that house, you've agreed to X, Y, and Z to give to me, right? You can't do that. And then if you say later, well, he can move if he doesn't like it, right? That's still obviously not a contract. Or for the privilege of being my neighbor, you owe me this, that, and the other thing. Or even if I go and mow my neighbor's lawn, it doesn't mean that he has to mow it from my lawn the next week. If he voluntarily wants to do it, great. But if I'm going to go hurt him because he doesn't do it, then I'm wrong. All right, and then I'm still stuck on the first part of how not to ask failure questions. This is a pretty great, this whole idea of not setting yourself up or setting other people up for failure is really practically really useful. I think I've talked about it to a good amount about how not to do it for yourself with goals, but remind yourself if you just maybe reflect on this from time to time. Remember, you can use a notebook and you can write down some questions and thoughts, but watch out for this because it can really creep back in to your way of operating. It's just set yourself up for failure, like if you don't accomplish a certain result in a certain time period or that sort of thing. Instead of having your beacon for progress be results, I know how that sounds reasonable, but it's not as helpful. It's not effective. It'll lead to basically it's ineffective compared to have your sense of progress be if you're building understanding. Have a clear idea of course, what the world will look like if you achieve your particular goal, and then be building understanding towards it. It's a lot like how you can clearly write a question on top of a page, right? Like, how do I rank a website, or this question itself on the screen. You can write a question, and then you build towards the answer. But you don't, halfway through, you don't see if the answer has filled itself in yet to see whether you're making progress, right? The answer doesn't fill itself in until it fills itself in, or if you're doing a math problem, right? You don't check halfway through doing a math problem to see if the answer is half there, right? You just keep on building, and sometimes you'll build in directions that will turn out not to be the way to build. You couldn't know that in advance. You just build until you get the answer, to get the result that you're looking for. And you can have a sense of of just a priority on what you're going to work on in life. So life is less about dropping certain things than prioritizing certain things, and you can just get a sense of where of what solving a particular question or getting a certain result, how big an impact that's going to have in your life, and then work on the ones where you're probably going to get your most bang for your buck. You are going to be able to estimate that decently, especially if you think it through with scenarios. And you won't estimate it perfectly, but you what do? You set your boundaries by crossing off. You think things through, and that'll lessen the approximation. That'll make you have a better guess of what's worthwhile to focus on. Anyway, how do you not ask failure questions? How was your sleep? How was your day is not a failure question. So that's probably why this person's wondering. You don't need to avoid asking questions like that. Now, it might be the case that if you ask your child how their day was, they might just grunt back at you and not really want to talk about it, particularly if you're sending it to school or something like that. But it's not what I meant by a failure question. It's kind of a different issue if you want to get a more more of a response out of someone, then one of the things is you don't necessarily pick the time and the place. If you want a particularly good response from someone about how their day was, then you probably want to create, here's a great way to illustrate a few concepts coming together. So let's suppose that the default situation, if you ask your child how their day was, is they basically grunt or just say good, right? So that's your default. Now you can struggle against that default by doing that, and then they say good, and then you complain about that, or you poke them or rib them and want more and start like grilling them or interviewing them. But then what that's probably going to do is have the effect of the next time they see you coming, they're probably going to run, right? Or particularly look like they're busy or something, so you don't start poking them about their day. But if that's the default, you need to change the game, right? So if you want to hear more about their day, you want them to open up, then you need to work on creating a whole context, which might partly just involve having better timing with when you ask them. But another type of thing is that how you act with them, and just creating maybe even an event or events that that can do it. And it might not be just one event. It might take prep. Sometimes things take more preparation, more context. If you open up the context a little bit by trying to have an event or a special day with your child, and they still don't open up, then you don't need to give up if it's important, and that type of thing might be. Instead, you expand the context yet again, and you use you go into the greater context and put more preparation in. I understand. My son is 3 years old. I understand, or I've heard that when kids are teenagers, and I've seen it from other people, that they tend to close up, and I know that they're going through a different stage in their lives where they're starting to deal with the idea of thinking how people think of them, presumably, right? That's kind of a new thing. As far as I can tell, kids develop a sense of identity in the neighborhood of starting around maybe 5. That makes it harder for them to learn the way they used to learn when they're much younger, like infants. And they start to establish their own identity, and then presumably when they're teenagers, they're starting to think about how people judge them and think about them. It makes them very self-conscious. I'm not like an expert on development, but I think something like that's going on. So I started 10 years ago with preparation and context for that, in anticipation that might happen. What do you mean I started 10 years ago? Well, I thought ideally, I wasn't going to force this on anyone, but ideally somebody would be home a reasonable amount with my child, right? But to do that, probably need to have my own business and so on and so forth. So, but I explicitly thought that. I thought that actually while I was still in college. So, and that's part of what I was thinking with having my own business. And someone might say, you made your own business because when your kid might be a teenager? Well, basically, yeah, it's part of it. I mean, if you're going to have a child, right, it's a pretty serious thing. It wasn't that I wanted to have a child or not, but I realized what I wanted to do was be married. And so I realized it might end up happening that I have a child. And seems like a pretty kind of important thing, including for my own quality of life and for the quality of life of my wife and for the quality of life of my child, for it to turn out pretty well, right? And so I started putting things in place. Like again, same thing, I had to change the game, right? By default, people aren't there a lot for their kids, when they're growing up, and they need to send them off to school and so forth. And so by default, that isn't, you send a child to school and you're really letting go, you're really subjecting them to a whole lot of randomness, and a lot of it's like a lot of negative randomness that could easily scramble their brains and give them a whole bunch of bad ideas. And so change the game, context, prepare well in advance. And if someone hasn't prepared and now their child's 13, there's less they can do, but you still deal with reality as you have it. And you start working on the context now. And then that is going to make the best out of your current life and everyone's current life. And that's always true, right? However things are right now in the world, you start seeking to not be satisfied with things that are bad. If default isn't the way you want, then you have to change the game, operate more in context, more preparation. Okay, so that helps to illustrate that idea about default, context, preparation, changing the game. How was school today is not a failure question unless there's an answer that's like a wrong answer in your mind. Did you brush your teeth? Very well might be. It also might be framed maybe through context and preparation. It's not a bad thing. Maybe that's not a moral issue. It's just if they didn't brush their teeth, then they need to go do it. maybe if they don't like it, then to them there's a right and wrong answer, and then you need to change the game and find a way to deal with that one way or the other. If making sure their teeth are brushed is part of it, I'm able to explain currently everything both to myself and figure out how to act, and explain it to my son who's 3. I know I already said he's 3. I'm just in case just because it's part of the context, so I repeat it just in case it wasn't heard. But I so far can explain everything and make all decisions based on the idea of keeping him safe and property rights, and I can pretty much decide what I'm going to do and when I'm going to make sure that he does something and so forth. I do not consider myself in any way a parent expert. I'm not trying to give parenting advice, but what I can do is give law of implication advice, which is just showing you how to work through certain ideas. That's one thing about. So you might, in some way, kind of force them to brush their teeth. However you interpret that, I'm not going to worry about what that means right now. But if you felt like they were going to lie, then instead of asking, you would mainly just stand with them while they brush their teeth or something like that. I would just find a way out of any kind of question where there's a wrong answer. And I just kind of have as an absolute that I'm not going to do it, and then I can always personally find a way. Maybe I can think of more examples in the future. One last thing about that is I make sure to establish a track record where people know that I don't jump down their throat if they don't do what the sort of correct answer is or something like that. All right, we're coming up on 2 hours, but let me see. I have a little bit of a second wind here, so I'll see if I can get anything else going on here. This isn't exactly a question, but someone said my health insurance was canceled too. The new ACA policy now costs me more than $5,000 more per year in monthly premium and deductible. That was a brutal tax increase, very sneaky. Yep. Yeah, technically not exactly a tax, but definitely a property rights violation between contracts between yourself and whoever you wanted to contract with regarding your health insurance or health care. Did we both eat at Bodo's Bagels in Charlottesville? Yes, we did. We did, Lance. I definitely ate there. Let me see. There's another final or close to. Oh, here's a couple. Let me see here. Someone said, why would I turn jury duty into a conflict? It's the reason it matters a little bit. It doesn't matter a lot necessarily. It matters a little bit because having, I don't know if you want to call it, there's plus and minuses to fully calling it slavery. It's definitely the people that made the 13th Amendment themselves, and I guess that was in somewhere around the 1860s, right? They themselves not only put slavery, but they put involuntary servitude in that amendment. It's a very simple amendment, not like laws these days. It's just like 2 sentences. The reason stuff like that matters is because of the ripple effects. If you have cops and judges and the law in general running a slave ring, again, what's the other word? Involuntary servitude ring, right? I'm not equating it with the more horrific forms of slavery. I understand that there's practically speaking differences, but the ripple effects of having stuff like that are very unhelpful, and also it's also a helpful template or example to use in terms of thinking clearly. But there's a real issue. I mean, if the idea that you have to do something because it's your civic duty is so nonsensical, I'll try to think also in the future about why I consider it particularly important to be on that. And the same questioner, they asked about, like it does help create, or they're saying the shoe shining example falls outside the maintenance of an orderly society. Well, many, many laws that currently exist that are being enforced, in my opinion, fall outside of an orderly society as well. And an orderly society is not our goal. This is why the idea of property rights, see, when you have a little bit of a wrongness in an important idea, then often the wrongness won't matter, but then it'll bite you. And by not getting what we're trying to accomplish with government exactly right, we see how badly it bites us now, where there's so many problems at this point with government. And again, like half my money is taken, or close to it. If I lived in a state where there was income tax, it'd be half. I moved to Tennessee, but I moved from somewhere I was comfortable. It was really hard. I didn't like moving. I was in Virginia. I had to move because of the income tax in the state there, or I chose to move, but it was, so you screw it up a little bit, and it gets bigger in a lot of cases, and so that's important. We don't want an orderly society. What we want is a society where property rights are respected. And regarding government, the one and only thing we want from government is property rights. That takes care of all the other issues: water sharing and oxygen and pollution and dealing with property rights violations, what otherwise called criminal behavior. Although the problem is criminal behavior is redefined to be a violation of the law, but the law does not coincide exactly with property rights, and so that creates a problem. And because some of the law has no justification, then many people throw out the entire law, right, and have contempt for it all. That's another problem. There'd be much more pervasive respect for the law if the law coincided with property rights better. And there would be less, it wouldn't get rid of criminal behavior, but there'd be less of it. When there's less environmental cues for either criminal behavior or property rights violation, then there's, practically speaking, there's plenty of proof scientifically. Scientifically is one type of proof. That's not perfect, but it's pretty useful to look at, where you reduce the cues, like the broken windows idea has a tremendous amount of support. Where if you have like broken windows and graffiti, and there's going to be more violent crime too, by having the government trample over property rights and disrespect property rights, then and then including obviously policemen who are enforcing that and representing that, you have them doing it, and then there's a lot more criminal behavior or real property rights violations as well. Sorry, those are the policemen. It's real when the police do it, but anyway, you can probably follow what I'm saying. Thank you. So instead of giving you $1 million would allow me the exclusive rights to be able to know all it is that you know, and having the ability to have my mind operate, think, and function like yours does, I would not be able to come up with a $1 million fast enough. I try to imagine just what and how my life would be, and I start to imagine all the stress and unhappiness to be lifted off of me. Anyway, thank you for allowing us to experience LOI, David, working at it every day. Great. Yeah, just keep working at it. And I've been working at this for, depending on how you measure it, maybe 25 years, maybe 20 years. 25 is fair. I had a particular experience when I was 16 that kind of particularly kicked things off, where I was lying in bed and I was thinking about God and Christianity. Christianity is the culture I was raised in, where I embraced it, rejected it, embraced it to some degree again, and so forth. And then I'd embraced it again to a good degree for some decent reasons when I was 16. But I was just thinking about how there was this, and I've told this story before, where, and we're a little bit over time here. It's time to kind of talk a little bit for those who want to hear. But in the one hand, God seemed real. On the other hand, God seemed kind of far away and fantastical. But also, separately, sorry, there was two ideas that struck me as not kind of that they were mutually exclusive, essentially, in Christianity. One is that the most basic decision we're here on earth to make is to choose to be with God or not, to choose to either accept God or choose God, that sort of thing, love God, have a relationship with God, however you want to call that. And then the other was that but there was this idea that we couldn't know that God existed, and that it was, people would say phrases like it's through faith that we know, which didn't seem to make any sense to me. Faith seemed like an important idea that I wanted to understand, but it didn't seem like it was just a magic wand to wave and all of a sudden I know something that I don't otherwise know. And so the two ideas were, we can't know for sure that God exists, and the other is that we're supposed to choose God. But that didn't make sense to me. And so I thought that if it was the case, if we start by stipulating one of them, if we stipulate that choosing to care about God or understand God or be with God or something like that was an extremely important thing in life, or the most important thing in life. If that was the case, which seemed reasonable, that something like that might be the case in life. So that seemed like the more reasonable of the two. So if I stipulate that decision is very important, or maybe all important, then it occurred to me that maybe there actually is a way to know, that I can maybe understand how that's the correct decision rather than just having to basically guess. Like if I accept the idea that I couldn't know one way or the other, and there's also an idea that a lot of Christians have, and I'm not endorsing it. I'm not really commenting on it, but I want to explicitly say I'm not agreeing with it or endorsing it, which is that if you don't choose God, then something really bad happens to you. So here's an idea where the idea is that it didn't make sense to me that we can't know what the truth is, but if we choose one way, even though we can't know, but we choose one way and something bad happens to us, God like punishes us or something, and we choose the other way, then that's good. It struck me that maybe there was a way to know, and it seemed like it made more sense that there would be a way to know if that was the case, and then it made sense that there wasn't a way to know. And so I said, God, if there's a way to know that you exist or what's true, and I didn't mean scientific proof. I didn't mean make a flash of lightning or some such. But whatever that method might be, if I could understand it, then in essence I was saying, look, I care regardless. It wasn't like I was saying I'll choose you if I can know. It was more like I was saying, just more like in a vacuum, that it seems like there very well might be a way to know for sure that you exist, and so please help me see what that might be, or something along those lines. And then really quickly, actually, that same night, I got, or even within maybe the same minute, I got a sense of things. I got and the sense I got, I'll try to characterize it, was, remember I said the start of the story about how God in one sense seemed real, in another sense seemed like kind of fantastical or far away or impossible to imagine. It occurred to me that to get to the idea that God is kind of fantastical or impossible or far away conceptually or whatever, I kind of have to start with nothing and then try to get God. And then it's true that it's kind of, how do you get God? Like if you start with kind of nothing, and then, but if I start with, here's this whole world and here it is and it functions and exists and so forth, and that also seems ridiculous. If I start with nothing, how on earth do you get with a world like this? So starting with nothing, everything seems ridiculous. But if I start where I'm at, which is this world exists in some way, shape, or fashion, right? This whole complex world, then there's a way in which God just makes much more sense. Now, that was just my initial thought. I didn't end there. I began there. So that is not like the conclusion, but it was a starting point. And so I started to, the next thing I did was become very interested in creation, evolution, intelligent design, whole arena. And it was through years of looking at that, and it helped get me on the path where I realized that we had to get even beneath where they were all at. They were talking past each other. And there was a way in which we needed to get on the same playing field, where we can get beneath perspectives, beneath assumptions and so forth. Also, there's something Tony Robbins said that made me think. And I think I've taken it further than he even intended. But I appreciate him for bringing this up, which is, Tony Robbins said, if you want to live an extraordinary life, then learn to think for yourself, including about what I say. And so I thought about what it would mean to think for myself. And then I thought about in 7 Habits, another iconic, book, Stephen Covey, another iconic kind of teacher in that era, and probably still, but in that era, when I was doing this, then he would talk about lenses and perspectives. But then I got to thinking that in order to truly think for myself, like if I just kind of sit by myself and try to think, even if I use a notebook or something, then I'm still using as a template or as my ingredients, I'm using all the stuff that I picked up from the environment, from my parents, from culture. So then that's not good enough, right? If I'm supposedly thinking for myself, but all my ingredients weren't developed from scratch. So if I'm still using a perspective. So I realized that to think for myself, I wouldn't just need to have a different perspective, but I would need to somehow get beneath perspectives. If I'm seeing the world through a lens or through glasses, like a lens basically, then how do I get to where I see something without a lens? And that led me to, to more. And it led me to the idea of the consciousness field, where I realized that, hey, if I divide the world differently than people normally do, normally people kind of conceptually divide the world into like the physical world and then like the theoretical world or the mental world or something like that. Maybe there's like a spiritual world too. I divided the world conceptually differently from the perspective of trying to understand it or from gaining knowledge. And that was, there's everything I'm currently aware of, whatever that might be, and then there's everything else. And what I'm currently aware of, I don't know conclusions of what I'm currently aware of. Like if my brain tells me that guy's a jerk or I'm so smart or I should, or this is right or that's wrong. I don't know it just because the conclusion, but I at least know that the thought is there, right? Or I look out and I see visually around me. I don't want to start by drawing conclusions about what I see, that it's really there, that it's really hard or really whatever, but I still am starting with that visual experience or something like that. So that's what I'm conscious of. By doing that division, and I realize that is to some degree clear, to some degree not clear for people. But I'm just kind of giving an overview for now, so I'll continue to move forward. By dividing the line there, that was a huge thing for me. Another, and everything else fell into place very differently by thinking of the world in terms of what I'm aware of, but I'm not concluding. I don't automatically get to know my conclusions of what I'm aware of, but just that I start there. And I need to find a way to get from where I'm starting, with my conscious field, to conclusions. And that way, what opened me up hugely to the way to do that was when I heard the law of non-contradiction explained. When I was in my low 20s at that point. I'd never heard it explained clearly before. I probably came across it in 7th grade or something, but it wasn't distinct for me. And a book called Not a Chance by R.C. Sproul, S-P-R-O-U-L, who's a Christian apologist actually, but he was writing about how chance basically didn't exist in a certain way. But he explained, and it was kind of related to the whole field of evolution and creation and so forth. But he was approaching things from a different angle, and he was changing the game in essence by showing. And he explained the law of non-contradiction very clearly for me, which is that something and its opposite, like P and not P, can't both be true at the same time and in the same relationship. Like the sidewalk can't be wet and the sidewalk can't not be wet. Those two statements can't both be true unless you twist the meaning of it. That's what the same relationship means. So that it hit me. That was like a major moment for me. And it hit me that was a way in which I could start to build. And I could start to see if I could resolve things into direct opposites, I could realize that exactly one of those had to be true and one wasn't. And I started being able, that in practice, that worked for me, where I had so much to do. Like I kept on making progress and having actual results, like things resolved or getting rid of ideas that would be inefficient or make me unhappy, just based on this idea of resolving contradictions. I then realized that what I was doing over time, as I'm trying to explain this to people, it took me a while to realize that I had a tendency or a kind of a natural way that I thought in scenarios. And I realized that other people didn't do it as pervasively. Now, some people might. I'm not in everyone's heads. But it started, like, I'm not in anyone's head. So one of my difficulties is that I'm only me. And so I don't know what it's like to be you. And so bridging between what I understand and explaining it to other people, I can certainly have some amount of effectiveness at it. But I've worked at it. I've had to work at it a lot. But there's also a hard limitation I have where if I could just get in like a few people's heads, it'd be really huge for me. I'd probably pay that same $1 million, just so I could get a better sense of what it's like to be other people, because we really experience the world like visually, like with our senses, we experience the world pretty, probably pretty similarly, right? But there's a way in which we notice different things and we process mentally that's really different. Like I do a lot in my head, a lot of my kind of internal mental experiences is like talking to you guys, actually. right? Like I work through ideas with scenarios, and then I also am thinking, like kind of talking to like a bit of an audience, or sometimes one particular person, but sometimes an audience in my head. Not an, I don't think that it's not like in I don't mean that I'm not narcissistic at all. I'm sure we all have that to some degree, but I don't really mean that. I think it's a misunderstanding if you take what I mean in a narcissistic sense, where when I'm talking to an audience, it's not like I'm worried about the reaction to me. I'm just trying to get ideas. I'm trying to explain ideas to people in a way that's understandable. And a lot of my mental, a little bit like might have conversations in your head with somebody if you're having an argument with them, but I'm not like having an argument. There's times that happens where I have that thing where I'm arguing with someone in my head, but a lot of my experience is either working through scenarios or kind of talking to people, helping them to see why certain things are contradictions. So it occurred to me that the scenarios and how I would add and subtract things from one scenario, and this occurs in like Hercule Poirot as a fictional character would sort of do this, and some degree of it's in like Sherlock Holmes books and so forth. So it's not like I'm not like the only person that does it by any stretch, but also there's a way in which people don't do it enough or realize that that's what I'm doing. And so I came to realize that that was an important ingredient that I needed to share with people as well. And anyway, that's just a little bit of the journey that I've gone through. And now I'm 42, so compared to being 16, I guess that's 26 years, right? Is that right? So depending on how you measure it, when I first came across the law of non-contradiction was probably right around when I was 22, 23, 24 or so. So about 2 decades there. Okay, I'm good for, do one more at least. Of course, people can listen to I know people are thinking, all right, I'll go now. I can listen to the recording or something. But if you have a legitimate reason to be angry, this is a particularly good question. If you have a legitimate reason to be angry about something, is there a way using LOI to get past it? Yeah, there is. Of course, for me, taxes is one of those things, or people stealing from me in other ways. Obviously, sometimes people trying to pirate or some amount of our stuff and things like that with OMG. Yeah, couple things. What you want to do with LOI is you want to start to accumulate things that you know are true and build from there. So there's certain things regarding anger that you can know are true. One is that you don't necessarily need to feel it in privacy. Like what I mean is, let's say someone's taxing me or stealing from me or whatever. Then in a particular hour of my day, then so I might want it to come to pass in the world that activity stops. And it's property rights violation, so there's a legitimacy to it being immoral. But do I need to sit around feeling angry about it or having conversations in my head with somebody about something or whatever? I want to be able to choose that, right? So just because something's wrong and a genuine violation of us doesn't equate to we actually feel angry. There's another thing which is deals a lot more than just anger. There's a misunderstanding that people have. This is actually pretty cool what I'm about to say. There's a misunderstanding that people have where they feel like they need to feel emotion in order to be motivated. And that comes from, it's one of the many issues with misidentifying yourself, misidentifying you with your brain or with yourself as a whole. I use the word self to refer to like your brain, mind, body, and so forth. So you are not even yourself in a sense. And by the way, sometimes I will, when I talk, when I'm not referring to that exact issue or when it's not important, I will talk conversationally the same way we all talk, like calling you and yourself the same thing. But anyway, I conceptually, and when it matters, I'm aware to make the distinction between you as a conscious being who's aware of your consciousness field and your brain. When you misidentify yourself as your brain, then you and your brain end up thinking that you need to be motivated. But you actually don't need to be motivated like you think. Your brain is not conscious. It needs to be motivated. It needs to know what to work on and what not to work on, like what results to try to get in life and what not to. I'm so glad, weirdly, that I got to this. This is really, really going to be great for people if you understand this. This is fascinating. So, all right, your brain is not conscious. So your brain doesn't actually feel. It doesn't feel bad. It doesn't feel good. When you feel bad or good, that what's going on is it's a signal that your brain is motivated in a particular direction. So it's a signal. You don't need to keep feeling it. You need to, and your brain literally can't feel it. The trouble is, if you think about a topic and you don't feel it, it might be an indication your brain itself is not motivated towards a result. So feeling bad is unnecessary. A certain type of pain or anger can be a signal. An emotion can be like a signal. I'm not necessarily going to be explain this so well that there's not going to be any questions about it, and then you'll have it fully. However, remember, you can work through this yourself. I'm giving you building blocks. If you look to me for conclusions, don't forget that you're almost violating the law of implication itself. So take these building blocks and work with them. But even on a kind of a simplistic level, this can be pretty cool for you. And we'll stick with the anger thing as the example. So I don't need to sit around feeling angry. Either I want my brain actively working, let's say, on solving the tax issue in America or the whole world, or I don't. I don't really want my brain focused creatively on the tax issue right now. I am on a path with the LOI where I am doing the thing that'll work best in order to solve the issue anyway. So I don't need to try to directly shortcut or short circuit things by going after that. When it comes to anger, you can take a look. All right, well, what am I trying to do? Am I trying to change this other person? Well, you can change another person in one of two ways, essentially, with behaviorism or some form of struggling against their default by putting effort in each new day. If that's the case, you're just trying to get a different behavior out of that person, different actions. And then you have to ask yourself, do you really want to remain? You probably want to change the game and get out of a situation if for some reason you have to keep on struggling to get a result you need out of another person, right? You want to change that game somehow. If it's a one-off type of thing where it's something someone did to you but it's not going to keep happening, then probably just forget about it because, and there's going to be something keeping you from that I'll get to next. But right, but if it's not going to happen again, right, if it's a person you run into once or hardly ever is going to happen, then, or if you're not going to do anything about it one way or the other, then why are you thinking about it? Focus on something else. You have your creative focus think about it as a bit of a shortcut. Think about it where you have creative focus for one thing at a time that your brain's going to work on, and your brain's a tool, right, that's going out and helping do stuff and accomplish results for you, getting you goods and so forth. So you want to focus on something that's going to most likely get you the goods you want. And probably feeling angry at someone for things is often not the most efficient use of your brain's creative focus. Now, here's a block. A block is going to be believing in justice. People believe in this concept. They believe in justice. They believe that it is important that not only does the universe, when someone does something bad, they may or may not believe that because of karma, the universe, or God some people believe that God is just, that God goes out and intentionally whacks the person as like an extra, right? Gives them an extra whack of bad stuff. That would be justice in people's heads. But then not only that, but they believe they need to help that along, right? If they believe that God took care of it all by God's self, then they wouldn't feel, then they'd just relax and let it go right there. So I do not, as far as I can tell, justice is not actually something that God upholds, by the way. I do not conclude that God is just. I believe that God functions differently than that in an abundant way. Anyway, regardless, if you're angry, it means it doesn't even matter what you think about God. You certainly don't think God's not taking care of it one way or the other, right? You figure you got to do something if it has to do with justice is what I'm saying. If you're angry in terms of well, I can't let this go because this person did something bad, and I need to make sure that they get something, an extra whack of some sort. I don't mean physically, one way. I mean that kind of metaphorically. And all I'm doing right now is I'm essentially working through scenarios, right? I'm kind of adding. But if you take a look at that, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. If you're going to be busy trying to make sure there's justice in the world, then first of all, you probably start somewhere other than some little violation. And that relates to the person's jury duty question. Yeah, I agree. I mean, jury duty is not like my main crusade in life, because if I'm going to try and stop bad stuff in the world, then that's probably not where I'm going to start, right? On the other hand, because it's a kind of simple thing that people can realize and understand, it's not a bad thing to mention, but I'm not going to be like devoting a lot of mind share to it, Uh, so if it's the case that you want to start single-handedly working on, or really contributing to justice in the world, if you think that doubling the bad in the world is a useful thing. First of all, there's a contradiction, right? Do you really need to double the bad in the world? Do you need, for all the bad that people do you need to double down on it by doing even more bad based on that to the person back? So adding more bad into the world isn't gonna help. Even if you were going to try to get justice, then you probably want to start somewhere else rather than what someone probably did to you. Given that you're still alive, and functioning, they probably, there's some people out there doing worse stuff. Now you might say, well, this is physically closer to me, but then that's more of a brain. That's how our brain works. That's one of the default things we know is a mistake, is that our brain tends to assign importance based on proximity in time and space, rather than if you actually think through what's going to actually give you the most bang per buck for what you're trying to accomplish in life. So there's a simple way to find ways to get off your default, to catch your brain. It's by the way, getting back to a very big question earlier that I'm just had a little extra remembering of insight on. It's interesting, although I definitely want to know the answer to how do I tell the difference between when my brain's running by default and when I'm kind of interfering. More important is to catch mistakes rather than, like, default itself is not a mistake. What you want to do is catch the mistakes, is probably focus on catching the mistakes of the default function of your brain rather than catching default functioning itself. So I wish I mean this kind of tongue in cheek. I wish I'd thought of that earlier. I don't feel guilty for not thinking of it earlier, of course, but I'm glad this is why, we kind of keep going. So that's why I haven't actually figured out that question very well yet, even though it's a pretty central or kind of seemingly important question of how do I tell the difference between what I do consciously and what goes on by default in my brain. What I've realized is that what I can focus on, instead of catching default, I try to catch the mistakes of default. So the whole proximity is important thing is a mistake of default. Right, the minute you're like, I got to get justice on this person for yelling at me or spitting at me, or when they were, or honking at me when when I was walking down the street and they laughed, or whatever, then it looks that's a pretty obvious mistake of default thinking, because it looks important because it's close. But if you really need to get justice in the world, start with like ISIS, or taxation or something like that, and much bigger. And also, instead of justice, you want this. I don't mean this in a religious sense. There's actually no other synonym for it that doesn't have a religious connotation, but repentance. You want, I don't mean, again, that in exactly in a religious sense, but you want you also, you want people to change from what they're doing. And you may need, I understand that we need some sort of deterrent, reasonably speaking. And so there's a certain type of economics that once in a while you might need to follow, where if people publicly see you backing down at the wrong time, then that might be perceived as a weakness, and you might invite sharks. And then strategically, you might need to win certain battles publicly in order to alleviate that. And I understand that. But that's different. You don't need to feel motivated by anger in those cases. You can feel motivated by the result that you want to get. And that thing about the brain and you, and think through yourself a little bit, and then you'll understand better as I talk about in the future. I'll definitely be revisiting this topic of all of the kind of ripple effects or ideas of what happens when your brain thinks it's you and you think you're your brain. And one of them is thinking that you need to feel ongoing pain in order to be motivated. You don't need to be motivated. You don't do anything except for seek goodness, or be dissatisfied with bad and respond to that by seeking understanding. You shouldn't need to be motivated by that, except that you get goodness out of that, right? You can feel good and be motivated by it, or you can feel bad and be motivated to get out of feeling bad by resolving the contradiction. That's all the motivation you need. Your brain needs to have things connected up by picturing things properly with scenarios and results that you want, and picture a result or what'll happen after you get a result is better, just like I teach in the results formula shortcut in the 2013 series in law of implication recordings. Picture what the world would be like after you get the result you want until you feel like, yeah, I really want that. Or picture the opposite and picture how you really don't want the opposite, and then that's all you need. Let me see here. Oh, thank you. Today has been so great again, David. Sorry, I know I said this earlier. I've been listening to last week's session every day and can't wait to start with re-listening to today's. I really can't wait to be able to meet you in November. God bless. Thank you. I actually didn't know when I started reading that it was only a nice comment, but nothing wrong with reading some nice comments. Let's see. Okay, this will, I'll promise everyone, if you stick with this one, this next question, whatever it might be, then I'll end it regardless. Hi, David. Do you agree that self-imposed constraints are necessary in life in order to achieve success? Where do you draw the line between appropriate constraints and inappropriate constraints? Is it reasonable for everyone to decide for themselves whether a constraint, external or self-imposed, is appropriate or not? Is it even possible to have objective clarity around this? Thanks for a great series, the LOI, by the way, very, very useful. Okay, let me see if how well I understand this. David, do you agree that self-imposed constraints are necessary in life in order to achieve success? Where do you draw the line between appropriate constraints and inappropriate constraints? So I'm guessing that now it may be the case that Paul, who has this question, is drawing this from something I said, but I'm guessing that he got it from another guru's teaching and is wonderful and is like asking me, and if you're here, Paul, you maybe clarify, are you asking me about someone else's teaching and what I think about the idea? If you're still here, let me look. I think he probably is, but yeah. Yeah, maybe you can clarify if you mean someone else's teaching, and then I'll continue looking at this while I'm waiting. Where do you draw the line between appropriate constraints and inappropriate constraints? I have a recording, you might have probably heard it, or might have heard it, where it's kind of a standalone bit of thing where I talk about adaptability, right? And what you want to do in life, and I'm just kind of taking this as inventory. Sorry, I'm kind of starting is my usual way, but I'm trying to like start with what I know and then I'll build from there. So you want to be solid. One of the reasons why it's so great to know what's true is there's a few things in life that you can know that are correct and you can stick with those solidly. And then there's a lot of stuff that you can't know what's right, and so you can be very flexible. And people generally could be a lot more flexible than they are. The trouble is they try to deal with the gray in life by kind of arbitrarily saying, here's where I'm drawing the line. And if I don't draw the line here, then there's a slippery slope and blah, blah, blah. Well, you don't really need to operate that way. Instead, you can be very strong about things that you know, and you can be stronger than people normally are about those things. And like, I don't want to say what I do under like extreme torture or not, but I like, in a sense, I'm so clear about not violating other people's property rights that like following orders wouldn't probably get me to do it, right? Either it wouldn't happen or it would take something pretty extreme to get me to violate someone else's property rights, as an example, because I understand it very clearly. Whereas other people, their morality is a little bit more murky for them. They don't quite know why. They have it kind of memorized. And so it's probably easier to break. Like it seems solid, but then it's probably easier to break them because it's kind of a bit of an arbitrary or what's the word I'm looking for? Like a little brittle, you know. So I try to make constraints in life by things I can understand. And if I think that a constraint might be helpful and I'm not sure, then I try to investigate that area of life and I try to think it through using my same method with scenarios, and I try to make like kind of a simple scenario and build it from scratch. Oh, and Paul clarified. Hi, no, it's really about what we decide is right or wrong, such as paying taxes. Now, I don't know if you meant to say paying taxes. Paying taxes I do strategically because someone will come and hurt me and take the money anyway, right? If I didn't pay it. So I'm in no way saying don't pay your taxes. I'm just saying that please don't be part of being a taxer, of being someone who supports extortion. So let's see. So something like, if we do talk about the constraint of property rights and how that will help ourselves be successful, it will help you be successful in various ways. One is, again, it'll actually open you up and help you to not feel guilty when there's not a property rights violation, but it's just somebody trying to pressure you with something. And part of being successful is being able to say no, right, to people and be able to use your time in certain ways that are constructive. Another thing is that remember that you have a strong impact on people around you, especially with the law of implication. Because when you understand why you know certain things, then you have an even stronger impact on the people around you than if it's just sort of done the usual way with kind of belief that you kind of harden through just like not looking at it very closely, is how most people's beliefs are, is they maintain them by deleting and marginalizing contrary information. Even if the belief is correct, it's still they don't want to look at it too closely, and which makes it harder. They don't have as much of an impact on other people because they're by doing that very thing, they're inspiring other people, or in a negative way, inspiring other people to not look too closely at their own beliefs. So you will tend to reinforce the idea of property rights with other people, again, which is property rights is more than just not violating, not stealing from people. It is, again, so much of it is not feeling bad or like you should do a whole bunch of things. It lets you cross off a whole lot of shoulds in your life as well. Here's some more. So useful or appropriate constraints are really constraints we know are truly useful, correct? Because we have investigated them and established that truth. That's correct. I think that is exactly right. What I do in life is I kind of like a quote unquote self-imposed constraint, but you don't know it. Like if you claim to know something, but you don't know it properly, you haven't built the proper understanding, it's basically arbitrary. It's not you that's doing it as a being. It's just your brain, which got the idea from just environmental factors, right? So the stuff that your brain believes, even if it believes it very strongly, if you haven't worked through it with the proper method consciously, then it's not you that's doing it. It's really just basically arbitrary anyway. And so now the constraints are actually imposed by your environment. It looks like they're being imposed by yourself, but yourself got it from the environment if you didn't intentionally construct it from scratch. So think about that. So then operating with these environmental constraints you had nothing to do with is obviously going to, at times, inhibit your success. And you won't know when it's going to happen because it'll just be vague and ill-defined for you. And you're welcome. Thank you. Paul followed up by saying he loves the LOI and really appreciate it, and thank you. Okay, super. Great. I'm glad we kept going through there. And I will continue next week. I also have a recording to release that actually made it almost 2 weeks ago, and I meant to check it over, but Mike actually went through it recently and liked it. So just the next one of my overview and rundown series. Another thing I'm going to do, I don't know if this concerns anyone still on this live right now, but I'm going to be making a particularly basic series for OMG where I'm going over the very basics of SEO and online business and so forth, because I got a couple questions last time about people still kind of feeling like they're missing basics somewhere. They might be in the membership area, but our membership area is pretty big at this point. But there's a way in which I think I can help people by doing that. So I'll make some recordings on that as well. Thank you guys so much. And I totally appreciate your encouragement and everything. Definitely is well received. One thing you do in life is I'll let you, as you're typing some final comments in, if something that you like that was good goes away, then you can look for more things that are good. But the stuff, anything you have, like appreciating what you have is just super great. And including, you don't have to be, of course, narcissistic or anything like that, or even the idea that, I don't worry what people think. Appreciating good things about what people think is totally valid, right? You're just trying to have a good experience in life. Obviously, if someone expresses appreciation or expresses love or caring or any kind of good sentiment to you, then enjoying that and getting a good experience out of it is worthwhile. Not that isn't obvious, but someone might have a question. I thought have it all figured out. Why do you need other people's appreciation? But it definitely makes me feel good and encourages me and certainly helps. So you definitely respected and appreciated when you with your comments. Well, that's going to be great for selling OMG Live 2015. Rich wrote that awesome stuff, David, has changed my life for the good. OMG Live 2013 was the best thing that ever happened to me besides marrying my wife. I'm going to save that and put it on the sales letter for this year. That's great. Thank you. Okay, I will end the session here.